Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the most intimate corners of Tudor England where nothing was truly private. Imagine this. You are standing in your bedroom, about to go to sleep, and there are 5 people watching you. Not strangers, but your servants, your family members, maybe even a priest. Now imagine going to the bathroom, and instead of closing the door behind you, you are sitting alongside 3 other people having a casual conversation while you do your business. Sounds like a nightmare, right? But for the people of Tudor England, this was just another Tuesday. Now, before we step into this world where privacy did not exist, I want to ask you something. If you find yourself drawn into this story, if these glimpses into the past fascinate you as much as they fascinate me, would you consider subscribing to this channel? Maybe hit that like button if something here makes you think differently about how people lived 500 years ago. And I am genuinely curious, where are you watching this from right now? Are you tucked into bed in California, listening from an apartment in New York, or maybe somewhere across the ocean in London? Drop a comment and let me know. I love hearing from you. Alright, get comfortable, adjust your pillow, let the room settle into that perfect darkness. Maybe turn on a fan if you like that gentle hum in the background. Tonight, we are going to discover just how different life was, when walls had eyes, when beds had witnesses, and when being alone was not just unusual, it was almost unthinkable. Let me take you back to England in the year 1500. You've just woken up, not in your own bedroom, but in the great hall of a manor house. All around you, bodies are stirring. Your lord and his family slept near the massive fireplace in the centre of the room. You, as a servant, slept on a straw mattress along the wall with a dozen other people. The night air is cold, but the warmth from that central fire kept everyone from freezing. This was normal, this was long. You see, the concept of privacy as we understand it today simply did not exist in the early Tudor period. It was not that people disliked being alone. They literally did not have the language or the architecture to support it. Privacy was not even a word people thought about. Why would you need to be alone? Life was communal. Safety was in numbers. Warmth came from gathering together. But then something remarkable happened. Something that would change English society forever. The chimney. I know, you're probably thinking, a chimney? Really? That is what changed everything. But stay with me, because this is where it gets fascinating. Before chimneys became common in the mid-1500s, you needed that one central fire in the Great Hall to heat the entire building. Everyone slept around it. Everyone ate near it. Everyone lived in the same space because there was no other way to stay warm during those brutal English winters. And trust me, Tudor England was cold. Scientists believe the climate during this period was even colder than it is today. We are talking about the Little Ice Age. Rivers froze solid. Snow lingered for months. But when chimneys became widespread, suddenly you could have fires in different rooms on different floors. You could heat a bedroom upstairs without needing everyone to crowd around a single hearth. This architectural innovation did not just change buildings, it changed behavior, it changed relationships, it changed the very fabric of how people interacted with one another. For the first time, the wealthy could retreat to their own chambers. Lords and ladies began to desire separate bedrooms. Nobles started requesting private studies where they could read or write without interruption. And here is the thing. Privacy quickly became a status symbol. The more private spaces you had access to, the more important you were. Think about Hampton Court Palace, built by Cardinal Wolsey and later taken over by King Henry VIII. The palace was designed like a series of filters. You would enter through the Great Gatehouse into Base Court, which was basically the arrivals area. Anyone could get that far. Then you would move into the next courtyard and the next, and each doorway had guards who would stop you if you were not important enough to proceed. The closer you got to the king's private chambers, the fewer people were allowed entry. By the time you reached the privy chamber, only the most trusted, most elite members of the court could enter. And beyond that, the king's actual bedroom, only a handful of men called the gentlemen of the privy chamber could go there. These men washed the king, dressed him, and yes, even attended to him when he used the close stool, which was the Tudor equivalent of a toilet. Imagine having that job. You're one of the most powerful men in England, and part of your daily responsibility is helping the king go to the bathroom. But here is the wild part. This was considered an honor, an incredible privilege. Why? Because you had intimate access to the king. You heard his private thoughts. You knew his moods before anyone else. You could whisper advice in his ear when he was most vulnerable and receptive. This shows us something profound about Tudor society. Intimacy was power. The closer you got to someone's body, to their private moments, the more influence you had. Now let us talk about something that might make you uncomfortable, but it is important to understand just how different Tudor life was. Going to the bathroom. In the early 1500s, communal toilets were normal. These were not like modern public restrooms with separate stalls and locked doors. We're talking about long wooden benches with holes cut into them, positioned over a pit or a flowing stream. Multiple people would sit side by side, sometimes 3 or 4 at once, just chatting about their day while they did their business. There was no shame in this, no embarrassment. It was just what people did. But as the Tudor period progressed, this began to change. The wealthy started building necessary houses, which were small private rooms, usually built into a corner of a larger building or as a separate small structure in the garden. These rooms would have a single seat, maybe a bucket underneath that servants would empty later. Still not exactly luxurious by our standards, but it was private, it was yours alone. For the super elite, like the king, there was the close stool. Picture an ornate wooden box, almost like a throne, with a cushioned seat and a removable pot underneath. Henry VIII's close stool was elaborate, covered in black velvet studded with ribbons and gilt nails. It was furniture fit for a king, literally, but even the king did not use it alone. Those gentlemen of the privy chamber I mentioned earlier, they were there, handing him cloths, ensuring he was comfortable, attending to every need. The king's bowel movements were a matter of state importance. Why? Because his health determined the stability of the entire kingdom. If the king was constipated, people needed to know. If he had diarrhea, it might indicate illness. His most private bodily functions were observed, discussed, and recorded. Let that sink in for a moment. The most powerful man in England could not even use the toilet alone. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but surely regular people had more privacy than the king, right? Well, not really. If you were a servant, you slept at the foot of your master's bed or on a small pallet in the hallway outside their chamber. You were always on call, always available. If they needed something in the middle of the night, you were there. If you were a married couple, you probably shared a bedroom with your children and maybe a servant or two. Beds were expensive, so families often shared one large bed, and I mean shared. Parents on one end, children on the other, all under the same covers. And here is something that might shock you. In inns, strangers commonly shared beds. It was normal practice until well into the 1800s. Travellers have written diary entries expressing surprise when they thought they had a bed to themselves for the night, only to have a complete stranger climb in beside them a few hours later. You would just scoot over, make room, and try to get some sleep. That was hospitality. This communal living was not just about practicality or lack of resources. It was about survival and social structure. In a world without electricity, without central heating, without modern medicine, being alone could be dangerous. If you got sick in the night, who would help you? If a fire broke out, who would wake you? If thieves broke in, who would defend you? So people stayed together. They slept together, ate together, worked together, and yes, even used the bathroom together. But there is something beautiful in this too, if we really think about it. These people had a kind of intimacy with one another that we have lost. They knew each other deeply. They could not hide behind closed doors or curated social media profiles. You saw people at their worst and their best every single day. You heard them snore, you smelled their morning breath, you witnessed their arguments and their reconciliations. There was a rawness to human connection that we have traded away for privacy. And yet, as the 1500s progressed, that trade began in earnest. The chimney made private rooms possible. Private rooms made solitude desirable. Solitude became associated with status and power. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the idea of privacy began to take root in English culture. By the end of the 16th century, something remarkable had happened. The wealthy had private bedrooms. They had studies and closets for storing their personal belongings. They had begun to think of their bodies, their thoughts, their space as belonging to them alone. This shift did not happen overnight. It took generations, and it did not spread evenly across society. The poor still lived in one-room cottages with entire families crammed together. Servants still slept at the foot of their masters' beds, but the seed had been planted. The idea that a person could, and perhaps should, have moments of true solitude had begun to grow. And here is what I find most fascinating. We often think of privacy as this fundamental human right, something that has always been important. But the Tudors teach us otherwise. Privacy is not natural, it is not universal, it is cultural. It is a luxury that became a norm and then a right, but only after centuries of slow change. So the next time you close your bedroom door, or lock yourself in the bathroom, or put on headphones to create your own little bubble of solitude, remember, you are enjoying something that your ancestors 500 years ago could not even imagine. You're experiencing a kind of freedom that kings and queens of the Tudor era did not possess. They lived in a world where walls had eyes, where beds had witnesses, where every intimate moment from waking to sleeping, from eating to elimination was observed and shared. And honestly, I am not sure if we should pity them or envy them. They had no privacy, but they had connection. They had no solitude, but they had community. They lived their entire lives surrounded by other people, for better and for worse, and they knew what it meant to truly not be alone. But this lack of privacy became even more extreme in one particular area of Tudor life, an area where the most intimate, most vulnerable, most shocking moments required not just witnesses, but actual participants. I am talking about the marriage bed, and what happened on the wedding night when consummation was not just expected, but legally required to be proven. Picture this: you have just gotten married, the ceremony is over, the feast is finished, and now it is time to go to bed with your new spouse. But you are not going alone. Your family is coming with you. Your friends are coming with you. The priest is coming with you. They're going to undress you, put you in bed, and then, well, we will get into all of that in the next part. Trust me, you're going to want to hear about the bedding ceremony. Because if you thought having servants sleep at the foot of your bed was invasive, wait until you hear what happened when Tudor couples tried to consummate their marriages. That is coming up next, and it's going to change the way you think about weddings forever. For now, though, rest well. Dream of a time when you could not dream alone, and I will see you in the next part of our journey into the hidden intimacies of Tudor England. Sweet dreams. So here we are, standing at the threshold of perhaps the most shocking Tudor custom of all, and I want you to really put yourself in this moment. Because what I am about to describe is not fiction. This actually happened to real people on what should have been the most intimate night of their lives. It is the evening of September 14th, 1501. Arthur Tudor, Prince of Wales, son of King Henry VII, has just married Catherine of Aragon in a spectacular ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Arthur is 15 years old. Catherine is not quite 16. They have only met a few weeks ago, and now they're married, their union meant to seal the alliance between England and Spain. The wedding feast has been magnificent. There has been dancing, music, course after course of elaborate dishes. The wine has flowed freely. But now, as the evening grows late, the real ceremony is about to begin. The bedding ceremony. Arthur and Catherine are led by torchlight through the corridors of the palace to their bedchamber, but they are not walking alone. Behind them comes a procession. Arthur's groomsmen, all young men of noble birth, laughing and making jokes. Catherine's bridesmaids, Spanish ladies who have travelled with her from her homeland, singing traditional songs, members of both royal families, courtiers, and yes, a bishop ready to perform his sacred duty. When they reach the bedchamber, the real spectacle begins. The bridesmaids surround Catherine. They begin to undress her, layer by layer. Her heavy gown, embroidered with gold thread and precious gems, is carefully removed. Then her kirtle, the dress underneath, then her chemise, her stockings, everything. Until she stands there, a teenage girl completely naked in front of a room full of people. At the same time, Arthur's groomsmen are undressing him. His doublet, his hose, his shirt, item by item, until he too stands bare. Now, I want you to think about this for a moment. Imagine being 15 or 16 years old. You barely know the person you just married. You're about to have sex for the first time, and you have to do all of this while 20 or 30 people watch you get undressed and climb into bed. Can you even fathom that level of pressure? That complete absence of privacy at the moment when you would want it most? But here is the thing, for Arthur and Catherine and for countless other couples in Tudor England, this was not unusual. This was the law, this was tradition, this was how you proved that your marriage was real. Once both Arthur and Catherine are undressed, the bridesmaids help Catherine into the bed first. The mattress has been specially prepared, covered in the finest linens, blessed earlier in the day by the bishop. Catherine lies down and the covers are pulled up to her shoulders. Then Arthur is led to the bed by his groomsmen. There is cheering, there is laughter. There are bawdy jokes shouted across the room. Arthur climbs in beside his new wife. And now comes the moment that probably armoured many couples from complete mortification. The bishop steps forward. He carries a vessel of holy water and a sprinkler made of silver. He walks around the marriage bed, sprinkling holy water on the mattress, on the pillows, on the couple themselves, murmuring prayers in Latin. He asks God to bless this union. He prays for fertility, for healthy children, for the continuation of the royal line. This is not just theatre, this is deadly serious. The entire future of England depends on Arthur and Catherine producing a male heir. The alliance with Spain hangs in the balance. Every person in that room understands the weight of what is about to happen. After the blessing, there is one more ritual. A servant brings in a large silver cup filled with what is called posset. This is a warm, sweet drink made from wine or ale mixed with milk and eggs, heavily spiced with cinnamon, nutmeg and sugar. It is meant to be both comforting and, well, aphrodisiacal. The idea is that it will relax the couple and encourage them toward their marital duty. Arthur takes a sip. He passes the cup to Catherine. She drinks. The cup is passed back and forth until they have both consumed a good portion of it. And then finally comes the stocking throw. This is where things get truly chaotic. The bridesmaids remove their own stockings. The groomsmen do the same. And then, one by one, they start throwing these stockings at the couple in the bed. The goal is to hit either the bride or the groom. If a bridesmaid hits the groom, it means she will be married next. If a groomsman hits the bride, he will soon find a wife. There is shouting, laughing, stockings flying through the air like soft projectiles. It must have been absolutely surreal. Eventually the stockings have all been thrown. The posset has been drunk, the bed has been blessed. And finally, mercifully, the witnesses begin to leave. They pull the heavy curtains closed around the four-poster bed, creating at last a small pocket of privacy. The guests file out of the room, still laughing, still making jokes, heading back to the feast to continue celebrating long into the night. Arthur and Catherine are finally alone. Or are they? Here is where the historical record gets murky, and where one of the great questions of English history emerges. Did Arthur and Catherine actually consummate their marriage that night? The next morning, according to the witnesses, young Arthur emerged from the bedchamber and called out to his servants, asking for ale because he was thirsty. He reportedly said, "I have been in the midst of Spain this night," a comment that was interpreted as confirmation that the marriage had been consummated. But years later, after Arthur died suddenly of illness just months into the marriage, Catherine would swear that the marriage had never been consummated. She would claim that they were too young, that they had simply slept beside each other like children. And this claim would become crucial when her brother-in-law, the future King Henry VIII, wanted to marry her himself, but needed the Pope to declare that her marriage to Arthur had not been valid. The bedding ceremony, with all its witnesses, with all its public ritual, was supposed to remove any doubt about consummation. But it could not actually force two nervous teenagers to have sex if they were too frightened or too shy or simply too young. And that is the bitter irony of the whole thing. All that public humiliation, all that invasion of privacy, and it still could not guarantee the one thing it was designed to prove. Now, you might be thinking that royal bedding ceremonies were unique because royalty always had different rules. But the truth is, bedding ceremonies happened at every level of society, though with varying degrees of elaborateness. If you were a wealthy merchant or a country squire, your bedding ceremony might involve just your immediate family and close friends, maybe 10 or 15 people instead of 50. The priest would still come to bless the bed. You would still drink posset. Stockings would still be thrown, but it would be a smaller, more intimate affair. Though let me be clear, when I say more intimate, I mean relatively. There were still a dozen people watching you get into bed naked with your spouse. For common folk, the poorest farmers and labourers, the bedding ceremony might be even simpler. Perhaps just the parents of the bride and groom, maybe a few neighbours, but the core elements remained the same. Why? Because consummation was what made a marriage legally binding. Think about that. You could have a ceremony in a church, you could exchange vows before God and witnesses, but if you did not consummate the marriage, it could be annulled as if it had never happened. The sexual act was not just a personal, private thing, it was a legal requirement, a social contract, a public concern. And this is where things could get truly uncomfortable, because in rare cases, if there was any doubt about the groom's ability to perform, witnesses would not just leave after blessing the bed, they would stay. I know, I am sorry, but it is true. If a groom was very young, or if there were questions about his health or virility, family members or trusted servants might remain in the room, hidden behind a bed curtains or standing in a shadowy corner, to ensure that consummation actually took place. They would not watch directly, at least not usually, but they would listen. They would wait for sounds, for confirmation, for proof. And if the groom could not perform, if he was too nervous, too drunk, or simply incapable, this would be reported, discussed, sometimes even recorded in family documents. The marriage could be called into question before it even truly began. Women had it even worse. There was the expectation, especially among the upper classes, that a bride should be a virgin on her wedding night. And how did you prove virginity? With blood. The bedsheets were expected to show blood after consummation, evidence that the bride's hymen had been broken. In some royal and noble families, the next morning after the wedding, the blood-stained sheets would be displayed. Not to everyone, but to certain key witnesses, the mothers of the bride and groom, perhaps a trusted lady-in-waiting. This was seen as proof that the bride had indeed been a virgin, and that the marriage was now fully consummated and legitimate. Can you imagine the pressure on these young women, lying there knowing that in the morning people would be examining the sheets, looking for evidence? And what if there was no blood? Not all women bleed during first intercourse, but in the 1500s they did not know that. No blood meant suspicion, doubt, whispers about whether the bride had been pure. It is no wonder that many women reportedly used tricks to ensure there would be blood. A small vial of chicken blood hidden under the pillow. A tiny knife to make a small cut on the inner thigh. Desperate measures for desperate times. And yet, with all of this public scrutiny, with all of these witnesses and rituals and expectations, bedding ceremonies were simply accepted as normal. People did not question them. Why would they? This was how things had always been done. Marriage was not a private arrangement between two people. It was a family matter, a social contract, sometimes even a political alliance. The couple getting married, they were almost secondary to the whole thing. But here is something beautiful that I discovered in my research. Something that gives me hope about human resilience. Despite all of this public pressure, despite the complete lack of privacy, many Tudor couples did manage to find genuine affection for each other. There are letters that survive from this period, letters between husbands and wives that show real tenderness, real love. John Johnson, a wool merchant in Calais in the 1540s, wrote letters to his wife Sabine that are absolutely lovely. He calls her his loving wife. He tells her he wishes she were in his bed. These are not just dutiful letters between business partners. These are love letters. So even within this system that seems so invasive and controlling to us, people found ways to connect. They found privacy where they could. They built intimacy over time after the wedding night spectacle had faded into memory, and gradually, very gradually, the bedding ceremony began to lose its grip on society. By the late 1600s, it was starting to be seen as old-fashioned, crude, unnecessary. The new generation of Protestant thinkers emphasized modesty and privacy. The idea that a couple should be left alone on their wedding night began to take hold, but it took a long time. Even King Charles I, who ruled from 1625 to 1649, famously barred the door of his bedroom on his wedding night, refusing to allow the traditional bedding ceremony. It was considered shocking at the time, a break with tradition, almost scandalous, but eventually privacy won. The bedding ceremony faded away, becoming first optional, then rare, then just a strange story that grandparents told about the old days. And what replaced it? The idea that the wedding night should be sacred, private, a moment belonging to the couple alone. We take this for granted now. Of course your wedding night is private, of course no one else should be involved. But for our Tudor ancestors, this was a radical idea. Revolutionary, even. So the next time you hear about a couple going on their honeymoon, disappearing to some private location where they can be alone together, remember, this is a luxury, a modern invention, a complete reversal of how things used to be. The Tudors taught us that privacy is not natural, it is earned, it is fought for, it is a cultural shift that takes generations to accomplish. And speaking of things that were definitely not private in Tudor England, we need to talk about what happened when a Tudor woman got pregnant, especially if that woman was a queen. Because if you thought the bedding ceremony was invasive, wait until you hear about the lying-in chamber, where pregnant noble women were locked away from the world for weeks before giving birth, sealed into darkened rooms that were designed to feel more like wombs than bedrooms. That is where we are going next, into the candlelit darkness of the birthing chamber, where men were absolutely forbidden, and where midwives held the power of life and death over queens and commoners alike. Trust me, what happened in those rooms makes the bedding ceremony look tame by comparison. Stay with me, we are just getting started. Picture a room where sunlight never enters, where fresh air is considered dangerous, where the windows are sealed shut and covered with thick tapestries, where every crack around the door has been stuffed with fabric to keep out even the smallest draught. The only light comes from candles, flickering and casting shadows that dance across walls hung with arras, those expensive tapestries woven with gold and silver threads. It is warm in here, almost suffocatingly warm. The air is heavy with the scent of herbs burning in braziers, roses, and lavender meant to ward off evil spirits and disease. On a table near the bed sits a collection of religious relics, a crucifix, images of saints, and most precious of all, a girdle said to have been worn by the Virgin Mary herself, borrowed from Westminster Abbey, enormous. This is the lying-in chamber, and for the next 30 days, possibly more, a pregnant queen or noblewoman will not leave this room. She will not see daylight, she will not breathe fresh air. She will not see her husband, her father, her brothers, or any man at all. She is entering a world that belongs entirely to women. Let me take you to Greenwich Palace on August 26, 1533. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, wife of Henry VIII, is about to take to her chamber. She is heavily pregnant, perhaps 7 months along, and according to tradition and royal protocol, it is time for her to withdraw from the world. The ceremony begins with Anne attending Mass in the Chapel Royal. She is surrounded by her ladies-in-waiting, all dressed in their finest gowns. After Mass, there is a formal procession to the great chamber, where Anne sits beneath the cloth of estate, that ceremonial canopy that marks her royal status. She is offered wine and spices, a last public refreshment before her confinement. And then comes the moment that must have been both a relief and a terror. Anne processes to her bedchamber, accompanied by her ladies and the women of the court. At the door she turns to face the assembled courtiers. The men bow deeply. This is farewell. They will not see their queen again until after the child is born and she has been churched. That ceremony of purification that will allow her back into public life. Anne enters her chamber. The door closes behind her, and just like that she has crossed into a different world. Now before we go further, I want you to think about what this must have felt like. You are Queen of England, you have power, status, influence, but now, in what should be the most important moment of your life, carrying the future heir to the throne, you are locked away, hidden, removed from all the action and politics you've been part of. And here is the truly wild part. Anne Boleyn knows that everything depends on this baby being a boy. Henry has broken with the Catholic Church to marry her. He has defied the Pope, risked war with Spain, thrown England into religious turmoil, all because he believes Anne will give him the son that his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, could not. The pressure must have been unbearable. But let us step back for a moment and talk about what this lying-in chamber actually looked like, because the details are fascinating and more than a little strange. The room has been transformed into something that barely resembles a normal bedroom. Royal carpenters and joiners have spent days creating a false ceiling, lowering it to make the space feel more enclosed, more womb-like. Then the officers of the wardrobe have moved in, hanging tapestries from every wall and even across the ceiling, creating a completely enclosed fabric environment. Why? Because Tudor medical theory held that fresh air was dangerous to pregnant women and newborn babies. They believed that air carried disease, that it contained invisible corruptions that could harm both mother and child. So the solution was to seal everything. No windows open, no drafts, just still, warm, candle-lit air. The floor is thickly carpeted. Remember, carpets were incredibly expensive in Tudor England. Most people just had rushes or straw on their floors. But for a royal lying-in, the floor is covered in the finest carpets that can be found, often imported from Turkey or Persia. And then there is the bed itself. Not just any bed, but the great bed of state, an enormous four-poster draped with the richest fabrics. For Anne Boleyn, there was also a pallet bed set up nearby, a smaller bed with its own canopy where she would actually give birth. The great bed was for afterward, for receiving visitors and recovering. Near the bed sits the groaning chair, an aptly named piece of furniture designed specifically for childbirth. It is basically a chair with a hole in the seat and handles on the arms so the labouring woman can grip them and push. Next to it, a gilded bowl for the afterbirth. Everything has been thought of, prepared, arranged, And then there are the relics. Anne, despite her Protestant leanings, would have had access to Catholic relics because in 1533 England has not yet fully broken from Rome's traditions. That girdle from Westminster Abbey I mentioned earlier, it is believed to have miraculous powers to ease labour pains and protect both mother and baby. Queens before Anne have used it. Queens after her will use it too. But here is what gets me. What really drives home how different this world was. Anne will not be alone in this sealed, darkened room. Oh no, she has her ladies-in-waiting with her. Her mother might be there, though Anne's mother had died a few years earlier, so perhaps her sister-in-law Jane, certainly her most trusted attendants. These women will live in this room with her for the next month. They will sleep on pallets on the floor or on small beds in the corners. They will eat here, talk here, pray here, wait here. It is like a prolonged slumber party, except instead of being fun, it is probably increasingly uncomfortable and tense as the days drag on. Think about it. You are trapped in a hot, dark room with the same group of women for weeks. You cannot go outside, you cannot see your husband, you cannot escape, and you are getting more and more pregnant, more uncomfortable, more anxious about what is coming. What do you even talk about after the first week, after the second? How do you pass the time? Some women brought needlework. They embroidered, they sewed, they created elaborate tapestries and clothing. Some had books read to them, though reading yourself was sometimes discouraged because, remember, Tudor medical theory suggested that mental stimulation could be dangerous for pregnant women. Too much thinking might harm the baby. I know, it makes no sense, but that is what they believed. Mostly I imagine they prayed. They told stories, they waited, and then finally labour would begin. When a queen went into labour, the room transformed from prison to theatre. The midwife, who had been standing by for weeks, now took centre stage. She was the absolute authority in this room. Not the queen, not the ladies in waiting, but the midwife. And this is where things get really interesting, because midwives in Tudor England held a unique kind of power that women rarely had in any other context. The midwife attending a royal birth was chosen with extraordinary care. She had to be a woman of good character, someone who could be trusted with the most intimate secrets of the royal family. She had to take an oath promising not to use anything from the birth for witchcraft. No keeping pieces of the umbilical cord, no taking the placenta for spells or potions. This was serious business because people genuinely believed that these items could be used in dark magic. But more than that, the midwife had knowledge that was considered almost mystical. She knew how to turn a baby if it was positioned wrong. She knew which herbs could speed labour or slow it down. She knew how to deliver a breech baby, coming out bottom first. Bottom first instead of head first. She could even perform emergency baptisms if the baby was dying, a power that normally only priests held. Think about that for a second. In a world where women could not be priests, could not hold political office, could not own property in most cases, midwives had the authority to perform a holy sacrament. They could save a soul. That is real power. For Anne Boleyn's delivery, we do not know exactly who the midwife was, but we know she was there, along with several other experienced women who would assist. Young, unmarried women were not allowed in the birthing chamber. This was considered too shocking, too explicit for virgin eyes. Only married women or widows who had been through childbirth themselves could attend. As Anne's labour progressed, she might have been moved to the groaning chair, or she might have stayed in bed, propped up by pillows and cushions. The midwife would have encouraged her to walk around if she could, believing that movement helped labour progress. They understood even then that staying in one position was not always best. And here is something that surprises many people. Tudor midwives actually knew quite a bit about childbirth. They knew that a baby usually came out head first, face down. They knew that the mother needed to push during contraction. They knew to support the perineum to prevent tearing. They used oil, often olive oil, to massage and stretch the opening, making delivery easier. They were not working with modern medical knowledge, obviously. They did not understand germs or infection. They could not perform caesarean sections on living mothers. But they had generations of accumulated wisdom, passed down from midwife to midwife, and some of their techniques were actually quite effective. When the baby finally crowned, when that head began to emerge, the room would have erupted in a kind of controlled chaos. The midwife guiding, the assistant midwives supporting Anne's body, the ladies in waiting praying fervently. Everyone waiting for that first cry, that sound that meant the baby had drawn breath and was alive. And on September 7th, 1533, that cry finally came, but it was not the cry everyone had hoped for. Anne Boleyn had given birth to a healthy baby, but it was a girl, the future Queen Elizabeth I, one of the greatest monarchs England would ever know. But in that moment, to everyone in that room, this baby girl was a disappointment. A failure, not the son that Henry needed, that the kingdom expected, that would justify everything Henry had done to marry Anne in the first place. Can you imagine what Anne must have felt? Relief that the birth was over, joy that her baby was healthy, but also terror. Crushing, suffocating terror. Because she knew what this meant. She knew that her position was now precarious. She had failed to deliver the one thing Henry wanted most. The midwife would have cut the umbilical cord with her special knife, a tool she used for nothing else. She would have cleared the baby's breathing passages by using her own mouth to suction, then tied off the cord with thread. The afterbirth would be collected in that gilded bowl, examined to make sure it was complete, because a retained placenta could kill the mother through infection. And then, while the baby was being washed and swaddled by the assistant midwives, Anne would have been cleaned up. But not much. Tudor medical theory held that a woman should not wash fully after giving birth. She should lie in her bed, in the same sheets where she delivered, for days afterward. Changing the sheets too soon was thought to be dangerous. So Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, lay in a bed soaked with blood and fluid, holding her daughter, wondering what her husband would say, what he would do, knowing that her failure to produce a son might cost her everything. And she was right to worry. Less than 3 years later, Anne Boleyn would be executed, her head cut off on Tower Green, accused of adultery and treason. But really, her crime was failing to give Henry a son. The lying-in chamber, for all its luxury and ritual, could not protect a woman from that kind of danger. All the tapestries, all the relics, all the prayers in the world could not change the sex of a baby. And in Tudor England, that simple biological fact could determine whether a woman lived or died. After the birth, Anne would have remained in her lying-in chamber for several more weeks. The first stage of recovery involved staying in bed almost constantly, barely moving. She would have been swaddled with linen cloths wrapped tightly around her belly, bound up to help her womb contract back to its normal size. She would have been given special foods, broths and caudles made with expensive spices, designed to restore her strength. Then came the upsitting, usually after about a week, when she would finally be allowed to sit up in bed, propped by pillows. Later still, she could move to a chair, could walk around the room, but always within this sealed, darkened space. Only after about a month, sometimes longer, would the room be opened. The windows would be unveiled, fresh air would flood in, and Anne would prepare for her churching ceremony. This was a religious ritual, a ceremony of purification that would allow her to re-enter public life. Only after churching could she return to her duties as queen, could she see her husband again in any formal capacity. And here is something I find both touching and tragic. During all of this time, Henry would not have seen his daughter. Not once. He would not have held her, would not have looked at her face. Because men were forbidden from the lying-in chamber, and babies did not leave it until the mother was churched. So Henry heard about the birth secondhand. He heard that it was a girl, and we know from historical accounts that he was deeply disappointed. He had wanted a son so desperately that he apparently could barely conceal his frustration. That tiny baby girl who would grow up to be one of the most powerful women in history, who would defeat the Spanish Armada and preside over a golden age of English culture, was initially seen as nothing more than a failure. The lying-in chamber was supposed to be a place of safety, of female power, of sacred transition from pregnancy to motherhood. And in some ways it was. Women ruled there absolutely. But it was also a prison, a place of pressure, a space where a woman's worth was measured entirely by what came out of her body. And soon we need to talk about the women who held power in these rooms, the midwives themselves. Because while queens and noblewomen were prisoners in their lying-in chambers, midwives were the uncrowned rulers. They decided how labour proceeded. They performed miracles with their hands. They saved lives and sometimes, despite their best efforts, watched lives slip away. These women held dynasties in their hands, and nobody remembers their names. That is where we are going next, into the world of Tudor midwives, the most powerful women nobody talks about. There is a room at Hampton Court Palace where no king ever entered. Not Henry VIII, despite owning the palace. Not his father, Henry VII. Not any prince, duke, lord or male courtier, no matter how powerful. This room belonged entirely to women, and at its centre stood a figure who wielded more authority in those moments than any man in England. The midwife. Her name has been lost to history. We do not know what she looked like. We do not have portraits of her, no detailed descriptions in chronicles. But we know she was there, standing in that candlelit chamber, her hand steady, her voice calm, as Elizabeth of York, the first Tudor queen, laboured to bring Prince Edmund into the world in 1502. And when that baby boy died shortly after birth, when the Queen herself died 9 days later from complications, it was this nameless midwife who held both their lives in her hands, who watched them slip away despite everything she knew, everything she tried. She would have been the last person to touch the baby's tiny body, the last person Elizabeth of York spoke to, the first to know that the Tudor dynasty had lost its queen. And then she would have been paid from the royal coffers, her name recorded in a ledger somewhere as simply the midwife, and she would have disappeared back into her life carrying secrets that could never be told. This is the paradox of Tudor midwives. They were everywhere in the most important moments of history, yet they left almost no trace. They delivered future kings and queens. They witnessed royal scandals. They knew which nobles were truly virgins on their wedding nights and which were not. They saw miscarriages, stillbirths and deformities that families desperately wanted to hide. They held more secrets than any confessor, more power than many courtiers, and yet we barely remember them. Let me tell you about what it took to become a midwife in Tudor England, because this was not some casual occupation you could just decide to take up one day. First, you had to be a married woman or a widow. Unmarried women, no matter how knowledgeable, were not permitted to practice midwifery. Why? Because midwifery required intimate knowledge of the female body, of sexual organs, of childbirth, and this knowledge was considered too dangerous, too corrupting for virgins. You had to have been through pregnancy and childbirth yourself. You had to know from personal experience what labour felt like, what the stages were, how long things should take. But experience alone was not enough. You also needed training, usually learned by apprenticing with an older established midwife. You would assist at births for years, watching, learning, slowly being allowed to do more and more until finally you were trusted to manage a delivery on your own. And then, if you wanted to practice legally, especially in cities like London, you had to take an oath. This oath was administered by the church, usually by a bishop, and it was remarkably detailed. You had to swear that you would not use witchcraft, that you would not keep any part of the afterbirth, the umbilical cord or the caul, that membrane that sometimes covers a baby's head at birth. These items were believed to have magical properties, and there was genuine fear that an unscrupulous midwife might sell them to practitioners of dark magic. You also had to swear that you would not show favouritism. that you would care for poor mothers as diligently as rich ones, that you would not allow a baby to be secretly switched or smuggled away, and most importantly, that if a baby was dying, you would baptize it immediately. This last point is crucial, and it tells us something profound about the unique power midwives held. In Tudor England, everyone believed that an unbaptized baby could not go to heaven. At best, the soul would linger in limbo, some twilight place between heaven and hell. At worst, well, nobody wanted to think about the worst. But baptism required specific words, a specific ritual. It was supposed to be performed by a priest, except, what if the baby was dying during birth? What if there was no time to fetch a priest? What if the baby took one breath and was clearly not going to take another? The church made an exception. A midwife in those desperate moments was granted the authority to perform an emergency baptism. She would take holy water that had been blessed earlier and kept in the birthing chamber specifically for this purpose. She would make the sign of the cross over the baby, and she would speak the words, "I baptize thee in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit." Just like that, a woman who could not be a priest, who could not give communion or hear confessions or perform mass, could save a soul. Think about how extraordinary that is. In a world where women had almost no official religious authority, where they could not even speak in church, midwives held the power of eternal salvation, and they used it. We have records buried in church documents of midwives baptizing babies who were emerging feet first, who had the cord wrapped around their necks, who were clearly not going to survive. Sometimes the midwife would baptize the baby while only its head had emerged, while the mother was still in labor, because she could see that this child would not live long enough for a priest to arrive. Can you imagine the weight of that responsibility? You are there, your hands slippery with blood and fluid, exhausted from hours of labor management, and now you have to remember the exact words, the exact ritual, because if you get it wrong, this baby's soul might be damned forever. But midwives carried this weight because they understood something fundamental. In the birthing chamber, they were the highest authority, not the father, not the priest, not even the queen herself. The midwife decided what happened next. If a baby was breech, coming out bottom first instead of head first, the midwife decided whether to try to turn it or to deliver it as it was. She would reach her hand inside the mother's womb, feel for the baby's position, and attempt to rotate it manually. This is called external cephalic version, and it is still done today, though now with ultrasound guidance and pain medication. Tudor midwives did it by feel alone, by experience, by an almost intuitive sense of anatomy, and it worked. Not always, but often enough that midwives were known for this skill, respected for it, called upon specifically because they were good at turning babies. They also knew how to manage a breech delivery if turning was not possible. The medieval medical text called the Trotula, which had been circulating since the 12th century, described techniques that midwives used. Keep the mother upright or on hands and knees to let gravity help. Support the baby's body as it emerges. Do not pull because pulling could injure both mother and child. Wait for the head to deliver naturally. These were not primitive superstitions. These were practical techniques based on observation and experience, passed down through generations of women who had no formal medical education, but who had something just as valuable, actual knowledge of what worked. There was a midwife in London, we do not know her name, who attended multiple royal births for Elizabeth of York. We know this because payment records show the midwife being compensated after the births of Prince Arthur, Prince Edmund, and possibly Prince Henry, who would become Henry VIII. This woman delivered at least 3, possibly 4 royal children. She held the heir to the throne in her hands. She knew the most intimate details of the Queen's body, and yet she remains anonymous, just the midwife in the accounts. But here is what we can deduce about her from what we know of Tudor midwifery. She would have been older, probably in her 40s or 50s, because younger women were not considered experienced enough for royal births. She would have been well paid, certainly, but not wealthy. Midwifery could provide a decent living, but it was not going to make you rich. She would have been respected in her community, known as a woman of good character, someone who could be trusted with life and death secrets. And she would have been exhausted, because midwifery was not a job you could schedule. When a woman went into labour, you went. Whether it was the middle of the night or the middle of a feast day, whether you were sick or tired or had other obligations, you went. Labour does not wait for convenience. For a royal birth, a midwife might be on standby for weeks, living at the palace waiting for the moment when the Queen's labour began. And then, when it finally started, she might be attending that labour for hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, sometimes even longer. First labours especially could take days, and the midwife had to be there for all of it, monitoring, encouraging, intervening when necessary. What did she do during those long hours? She massaged the mother's back with herbal oils. She gave her drinks of wine mixed with herbs to strengthen her. She walked with her around the room when movement seemed to help. She checked the progress of labour by internal examination, feeling how dilated the cervix had become. And she talked. She encouraged. She told the labouring woman that she was doing well, that the baby would come soon, that everything would be all right, even when she was not sure that was true, even when she could feel that something was wrong, that the baby was too large or positioned badly, or that the mother was bleeding too much. She maintained her calm voice, her steady presence. Because panic was contagious. If the midwife panicked, everyone panicked. If the midwife stayed calm, the mother could stay calm, and staying calm could mean the difference between life and death. But sometimes, despite everything the midwife knew, despite all her skill and experience, things went wrong. Childbirth in Tudor. England killed women with brutal regularity. We estimate that somewhere between 10 and 25% of women died in childbirth or from complications in the weeks afterward. That is not a small number. That means that every woman who got pregnant knew that she was taking a real risk, that her life was genuinely in danger, and the midwife knew it too. She had watched women die. She had held their hands as they bled out, as infection set in, as fever consumed them. She had delivered babies who never drew breath. She had tried desperately to save both and sometimes lost both. There is a case from 1536 that haunts me. Anne Boleyn, who we talked about earlier, had a miscarriage in January of that year. She was about 15 weeks pregnant, maybe closer to 4 months. The baby was malformed, reportedly a boy but with obvious deformities. This happened in private, with only her ladies and the midwife present. That midwife would have been the first person other than Anne herself to see that malformed fetus. She would have known immediately what this meant for Anne. She would have understood that when Henry heard about this, heard that Anne had not only miscarried, but had miscarried a deformed child, his superstitious mind would interpret it as a sign that the marriage was cursed. And she would have been right. Less than 5 months later, Anne Boleyn was arrested, tried for adultery and treason, and executed. Did the miscarriage contribute to Henry's willingness to believe the charges against her? Absolutely. Did the midwife know in that moment that she was witnessing the beginning of the end for this queen? I think she must have. But what could she do? What could she say? She cleaned up the evidence, she tended to Anne, and she kept her mouth shut. Because that was part of the oath too, though it was rarely written down. Midwives were expected to keep secrets. What happened in the birthing chamber stayed in the birthing chamber. Unless, of course, powerful people needed those secrets revealed. Because here is the dark side of the midwife's power. She could be compelled to testify. If there was a question about whether a marriage had been consummated, the midwife who examined the bride afterward could be called to give evidence. If there was doubt about whether a baby was really the child of its supposed parents, the midwife who delivered it could be questioned. If a woman claimed her husband was impotent and wanted an annulment, a midwife might be brought in to examine both parties and give her professional opinion. These examinations were humiliating, invasive, and completely legal. A midwife's testimony could make or break a marriage, could determine inheritance, could even affect political alliances. So yes, midwives had power, but it was a complicated power, one that came with enormous responsibility and considerable risk. And yet women sought this profession. They trained for it. They took the oath. They spent years perfecting their skills. Why? Partly for the income, certainly. Midwifery paid better than most jobs available to women. But I think there was something else too. In the birthing chamber, women ruled. For a few hours or days, men were shut out. The normal hierarchy was suspended, and everything depended on female knowledge, female skill, female authority. The midwife was the expert, the decision-maker, the one everyone looked to for guidance. For women who lived in a society that told them they were inferior, that they needed male guidance and protection, that their opinions did not matter, the birthing chamber must have felt like a different world. A world where being a woman was not a disadvantage but the entire point. And so they stepped into that world, these nameless midwives, and they caught babies and saved lives and baptized dying infants and kept secrets and witnessed history. They were there for the most intimate moments of the most powerful people in England. They held the future in their blood-stained hands. We should remember them. We should know their names, their stories, their triumphs and their sorrows. But we do not. History, written mostly by men about events that men considered important, erased them almost completely. Almost, but not quite. Because every time a historian finds a payment record, a legal deposition, a brief mention in a letter or diary, we catch a glimpse of these women. We see their shadows moving through the birthing chambers of the past. And we remember that power takes many forms, that authority is not always official, and that sometimes the most important people in the room are the ones whose names nobody bothered to record. But while midwives held power in the birthing chamber, they had no authority over what happened before the baby was conceived. And that brings us to a whole different kind of intimacy, one that was simultaneously celebrated and condemned, natural and sinful, essential and dangerous. Because Tudor England had a deeply complicated relationship with sex, especially sex within marriage, and what the church said you should do in the bedroom was frankly bizarre. That is where we are headed next. Into the marriage bed, where duty and desire collided, where pleasure was forbidden but procreation was mandatory, and where the rules were so restrictive that it is honestly a wonder anyone in Tudor England managed to have children at all. Trust me, what I am about to tell you will make you very, very grateful you live in the 21st century. Imagine opening a marriage manual from 1534. The pages are thick parchment, the text is in Latin and Middle English, and it has been written by celibate male clergy who have never experienced the thing they are writing about. Yet these men, who have taken vows never to touch a woman romantically, are about to give you extremely specific instructions about how, when, and why you should have sex with your spouse. Welcome to marital intimacy in Tudor England, where the church had an opinion about literally everything you did in bed. Let me start with the prohibited days, because this is where things get absolutely wild. You could not have sex on Sundays. That is the Lord's Day, dedicated to worship and rest. Sex would be inappropriate, even sinful, so that eliminates one day per week right there. You could not have sex on any feast day, and there were a lot of feast days. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, All Saints' Day, the Feast of the Assumption, the Annunciation, and dozens more throughout the year. We are talking about at least 40 or 50 days, probably more. You could not have sex on fast days, and in Tudor England, there were more than 150 fast days per year. Every Friday was a fast day, every day of Lent, which lasted 40 days, Ember Days, Rogation Days, the vigils before major feasts. If you were truly observing all the fast days the church recommended, you were fasting about half the year. You could not have sex while your wife was menstruating. This was considered unclean, polluting. A woman during her monthly courses was thought to be contaminated, and any man who touched her sexually during this time was committing a sin. So there go another 5 to 7 days per month. You could not have sex while your wife was pregnant. The reasoning here was that sex during pregnancy might harm the baby, or worse, somehow create a second conception, resulting in some kind of monstrous double pregnancy. So for the entire 9 months of pregnancy, no intimacy. You could not have sex while your wife was breastfeeding. Breastfeeding was believed to prevent conception, so sex during this time was pointless, just indulgence in lust with no procreative purpose. And since wealthy women often breastfed for a year or more, and poorer women might breastfeed for 2 years to space out pregnancies, this eliminated a significant portion of married life. And you could not have sex for 40 days after your wife had given birth. This was the period before her churching ceremony, when she was considered ritually impure. Sex during this time would compound the impurity and endanger the husband's soul. Now, if you're keeping track, let me do the math for you. Sundays eliminate 52 days. Feast days eliminate another 50 or so. Fast days eliminate 150 more. Menstruation takes away about 60 days per year. And that is before we even count pregnancy and breastfeeding, which could eliminate years at a time. If you followed all of these rules strictly, you would have perhaps 1 permissible day per week for marital intimacy. Maybe. And that is assuming your wife was not pregnant or breastfeeding, which was unlikely since the whole point of sex in marriage was to produce children. Do you see the problem here? The church told you that the purpose of marriage was procreation, that it was your duty to be fruitful and multiply. But then it also told you that you could only have sex on certain days, and those days added up to maybe 50 or 60 days per year, at most. It was an impossible standard. And here is the beautiful, rebellious truth. Almost nobody followed it. We know this because, well, people kept having babies. Lots of babies. And if everyone had actually restricted themselves to the approved days, the birth rate would have been much, much lower. We also know it because priests complained about it constantly. In sermons, in confession manuals, in theological writings, clergy are forever lamenting that married couples are not observing the prohibited times, that they are giving into lust instead of practicing restraint. But you know what? I cannot really blame the couples, because the rules were not just restrictive, they were actively contradictory. On one hand, the church said that marriage existed primarily for procreation. The first purpose of marriage, according to Catholic theology, was to produce children. The second purpose was to provide a licit outlet for sexual desire, preventing fornication. The third purpose, way down the list, was mutual companionship and support. So having children was paramount, essential, the main point. But on the other hand, you were supposed to abstain from sex for the majority of the year, which made it much harder to actually conceive those children you were required to produce. It made no sense. And people knew it made no sense. But the church had the authority, so the rules stood, even if nobody really followed them. Now let us talk about what you were allowed to do on those rare permissible days when the stars aligned, and you were actually permitted to be intimate with your spouse. First, and this is important, you had to do it correctly. And by correctly, I mean in the one approved position, the missionary position, with the husband on top and the wife beneath him. Why? Because this position was seen as natural, as ordained by God. It reflected the proper hierarchy of marriage, with the man dominant and the woman submissive. It was also thought to be the position most conducive to conception, since gravity would help the man's seed reach the woman's womb. Any other position was considered sinful. Woman on top? That reversed the natural order, giving the woman inappropriate power and control. It was seen as the wife dominating her husband, which was against nature and against God's design. Side by side, from behind, any variation at all? These positions were associated with animals, with lust, with the pursuit of pleasure rather than procreation. And that brings us to the most important rule of all: you are not supposed to enjoy it. Well, let me be more specific. The husband was permitted to experience pleasure. After all, male pleasure was considered necessary for conception. The man had to climax to produce seed, so obviously some pleasure was involved. But he was supposed to view it as a regrettable necessity, not something to be pursued for its own sake. He was meant to approach the marital bed with sobriety and seriousness, remembering that he was fulfilling a duty, not seeking entertainment. But for the wife, absolutely not. Female pleasure was not only unnecessary, it was dangerous. Medical authorities following ancient Greek and Roman theories actually believed that women needed to experience some pleasure in order to conceive. They thought that female orgasm released a seed that mixed with the male seed to create new life. So technically, female pleasure was part of the procreative process. But the church was deeply uncomfortable with this idea. Female desire, female pleasure was associated with Eve's temptation, with woman's inherent weakness and susceptibility to sin. A woman who took pleasure in sex might become insatiable, might seek it outside of marriage, might become a temptress leading men into sin. So the official advice given to women was to lie still, to endure, to think of anything else but what was happening. Think of your duty to God. Think of the children you hope to conceive. Think of England if you are a patriotic sort. But do not, under any circumstances, allow yourself to feel pleasure or desire. In fact, there was genuine concern that if women were educated, if they learned to read and think, they might become too stimulated mentally, and this would lead to physical arousal. So one argument against female education was literally that it might make women want sex, and that would be dangerous. The recommended treatment for women who seem too interested in intimacy: fresh air, lots of walking, simple, bland food. No reading, no music, no dancing, nothing that might excite the senses. Basically, bore yourself into submission. I wish I were making this up, but there are actual medical treatises from this period that prescribe walks in cold air and a diet of plain bread as a cure for female desire. And if you think this is depressing, wait, because it gets even stranger. There were manuals written by physicians and theologians that attempted to determine the exact best time for conception. They calculated that certain times of day, certain phases of the moon, even certain seasons of the year were more conducive to creating healthy children. Some authorities believed that children conceived in summer would be weak because the heat would make the seed too thin. Children conceived in winter might be melancholic because the cold would make the seed too thick and slow. Spring was considered ideal, with its moderate temperatures and renewal of life. Autumn was acceptable, though not quite as good as spring. The time of day mattered too. Some said morning was best when both husband and wife were well rested. Others argued for evening after the body had been warmed by the day's activities. A few suggested the middle of the night, during that wakeful period we talked about earlier between first sleep and second sleep. And then there were calculations about the woman's age, the man's age, whether they had eaten recently, whether they had bathed. Every variable was analysed, debated, written about at length by men who, remember, were celibate and had no personal experience with any of this. But here is what I find most fascinating. Despite all of these rules, despite all of this control and restriction and prohibition, real marriages existed. Real people loved each other. Real couples found ways to be intimate and tender and affectionate despite living in a system designed to make them feel guilty about their own bodies. There is a wonderful example from 1543. A merchant named John Johnson lived in Calais, where he worked in the wool trade. His wife Sabine stayed in England managing his business interests there. They wrote letters to each other constantly, and some of these letters have survived. In one letter, John signs off by writing that he wishes Sabine were in his bed with him. This is not couched in euphemism. It is not hidden. He just straight up tells his wife that he misses her physical presence, that he wants her there with him at night. And in her letters, Sabine is equally affectionate, calling him her loving husband, expressing her own loneliness without him. These are real people who genuinely cared for each other, who missed each other, not just as business partners, but as lovers and companions. The church could make all the rules it wanted, but it could not stop people from developing real feelings, real connections, real desire for one another. There is another case that always makes me smile. A woman named Joan Thynne, married to John Thynne, who would eventually inherit Longley, one of the great estates of England. Joan was incredibly capable. She managed the estates when John was away in London. She gave him advice on everything from family politics to how to pursue a knighthood, and we have evidence that John actually listened to her. He valued her opinion. He respected her judgment. They seem to have had a genuine partnership, not just a marriage of convenience or political alliance. This woman was not lying back and thinking of England. She was an active participant in her marriage, in her life, in her world. So despite everything the church said about female passivity and submission, real Tudor marriages included women who were strong, opinionated, capable, and valued by their husbands. But let us be honest, not all marriages were like this. Not every couple found affection. There is a text from 1563 called An Homily of the State of Matrimony that was meant to be read in churches, and it is depressingly realistic about marriage. It talks about how few marriages exist without chidings, brawlings, tauntings, repentings, bitter cursings, and fightings. That is the actual language used. Chidings and brawlings, bitter cursings and fightings. This was the official church document meant to be read aloud to congregations. And it basically admits that most marriages were full of conflict. The homily goes on to advise both husbands and wives to practice patience, understanding, and self-restraint, to overlook each other's faults, to remember that marriage is a lifelong commitment and that they need to find ways to coexist peacefully because divorce was not an option. And it truly was not an option. You could not just decide you were unhappy and leave. Marriage was for life. The only way out was death or annulment. And annulments were difficult to obtain and expensive. You had to prove that the marriage had never been valid in the first place, which required showing that there was some impediment. You were too closely related. One of you was insane when you married. There was a pre-contract with someone else, or the marriage had never been consummated. For most people, annulment was impossible. They could not afford the legal fees. They did not have grounds. They were stuck. Wealthy nobles could sometimes obtain annulments or legal separations. King Henry VIII famously changed the entire structure of the English church so he could annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. But common people, if you were a farmer or a shopkeeper and your marriage was miserable, your options were basically to endure it or to simply leave and hope your spouse did not track you down. Some people did leave. They just walked away, moved to another town, started over. There are records of abandoned spouses seeking legal remedies, trying to force their runaway partners to return. Sometimes the church courts would order someone to return to their spouse. Whether they actually did is another question, but most people stayed. They stayed in marriages that might have been loveless, might have been contentious, might have been actively miserable. Because that was what you did. Marriage was not primarily about personal happiness. It was about economic survival, about continuing the family line, about fulfilling social expectations. And yet within that system, some people did find happiness. Some couples did genuinely love each other. Some marriages became partnerships of mutual respect and affection, even if they did not start that way. The bed was the most intimate space these couples shared, not just for procreation, though that was certainly part of it, but for conversation in the quiet hours of night, for comfort, when one was sick or scared, for the kind of closeness that comes from sleeping beside the same person for years or decades, learning their breathing, their warmth, their presence in the dark. And the bed itself was important, significant in ways we might not immediately understand. Remember, beds were expensive. A good bed was a major investment. William Shakespeare famously left his wife Anne his second best bed in his will. And people have debated for centuries what that meant. Was it an insult? Was it actually a gesture of affection, leaving her the bed they had shared while the best bed was kept for guests? We will never know. But the fact that beds warranted specific mention in wills tells us they mattered. They were valuable, both economically and emotionally. Some families kept their beds in the main living areas of the house, not in separate bedrooms. The bed would be set up in the great hall or the main room, often positioned where it could be seen from the street through the windows. Why? To show it off, to demonstrate wealth and status. Look at us, we can afford a proper bed with hangings and a mattress, not just a straw pallet on the floor. At night, curtains would be drawn around the bed, creating a small private space within the larger room. It was not complete privacy, not by modern standards, but it was something, a little cave of fabric and darkness where a couple could whisper to each other, could touch without being directly observed, could have moments that belonged to them alone. And maybe that is the most revolutionary thing about the Tudor marriage bed. In a world with almost no privacy, in a society that tried to regulate every aspect of intimacy, in a religious culture that viewed pleasure with suspicion and desire with fear, the bed remained a space where people could still be human, where they could still want each other, care for each other, find comfort in each other. The church could make its rules, society could impose its expectations, but in the darkness behind those bed curtains, people were just people, flawed, complicated, often tired, sometimes loving, occasionally lustful, doing their best to navigate a life that gave them very little control over their own bodies and choices. And speaking of bodies, we need to talk about sleep itself, because the way Tudor people slept was completely different from how we sleep today, and it tells us something profound about human nature and how much our modern world has changed us. What happened between those bed curtains was not just intimacy, it was a pattern of rest that we have completely lost. That is where we are going next, into the strange world of first sleep and second sleep, of midnight waking, and of what people did during those dark hours when the whole household was supposed to be resting but nobody actually was. It is 2 o'clock in the morning in a Tudor household and you have just woken up. Not because something is wrong, not because you heard a noise or felt uncomfortable. You've woken up naturally, completely alert, as if your body has an alarm clock set for this exact moment. And here is the strange part. This is normal. This is what your body is supposed to do. You sit up in bed. The house is quiet but not silent. You can hear other people moving around in nearby rooms. Footsteps on the wooden floors, the creak of a door. Low voices murmuring, everyone else is awake too. Welcome to the world of first sleep and second sleep, one of the most fascinating and completely lost aspects of pre-industrial life. Let me explain what I mean, because this is going to sound bizarre to our modern ears. People in Tudor England did not sleep the way we sleep. They did not go to bed at 10 or 11 at night, sleep straight through for 7 or 8 hours, and wake up in the morning. That pattern, the one we think of as natural and normal, is actually a modern invention. Instead, Tudor people went to bed shortly after dark, usually around 8 or 9 in the evening. They would sleep for about 3 to 4 hours. This was called first sleep. Then they would wake up naturally and completely, usually around midnight or 1 in the morning. They would be awake for 1 to 2 hours, and then they would go back to sleep for another 3 to 4 hours, called second sleep, waking with the dawn. This was not insomnia, this was not a sleep disorder. This was the normal, natural sleep pattern for humans for thousands of years. And we have proof, lots of proof. There are references to first sleep and second sleep in literature, in diaries, in court records, in medical texts all over Europe for centuries. A medieval prayer manual from the 15th century instructs people to use the time between first and second sleep for prayer and meditation. A physician's guide from the 1600s recommends that the best time for conception is after first sleep, when both husband and wife are rested but not yet deeply asleep. Court depositions mention events happening after first sleep or before second sleep, using these terms as casually as we might say after lunch or before dinner. Nobody had to explain what first sleep and second sleep meant. Everyone knew it was universal. But what did people do during that wakeful hour or two in the middle of the night? What happened in the darkness between sleeps? Some people prayed. The Catholic Church had prayers specifically designated for different hours of the night, and the time between first and second sleep was considered particularly holy, a quiet moment when the soul was closest to God. People would kneel beside their beds, say their prayers, meditate on scripture, prepare themselves spiritually for the day ahead. Some people read. If you were wealthy enough to own books and literate enough to read them, and if there was a full moon providing natural light through the window, you could read for an hour or so. There are records of scholars reading philosophy by moonlight, of nobles catching up on correspondence, of devout Christians studying their prayer books. Some people worked. Servants might use this time to complete tasks they had not finished during the day. A woman might work on her needlework or mending. A man might sharpen tools or make minor repairs. The house was quiet. There were fewer distractions, and this wakeful hour could be surprisingly productive. But here is what interests me most. What really tells us something about Tudor intimacy. Many couples used this time to talk to each other. Think about it. During the day, a Tudor household was chaos. Children running around, servants coming and going, work to be done, meals to prepare, endless tasks demanding attention. A married couple might barely have time for a real conversation. Even at night, as we've discussed, there was rarely true privacy. Other people were sleeping nearby, sometimes in the same room. But in that hour between first sleep and second sleep, when the house was as quiet as it would ever be, when the darkness created a kind of intimacy that daylight never could, couples could actually talk. They could share their thoughts about the day, their worries about the future, their hopes and fears. They could discuss problems that needed solving, decisions that needed making. And yes, they could be intimate, physically intimate. In fact, medical authorities of the time believed that the hour after first sleep was the ideal time for marital relations. The reasoning was that both husband and wife were rested, their bodies were warm from sleep, but they were not so deeply asleep that arousal would be difficult. The man was thought to have more vigour after resting, and the woman was believed to be more receptive. There is even a theory, and I find this completely fascinating, that this wakeful period evolved specifically to encourage reproduction. Think about it from an evolutionary perspective. Humans are one of the only mammals that have sex at night, in darkness, in private. Most other animals mate during the day when they can see, but humans, with our complex social structures and our need for privacy, developed this pattern of waking in the middle of the night, when it was truly dark and quiet, when there was real opportunity for intimacy without interruption. I cannot prove this theory is true, but it makes a certain kind of sense, does it not? Now you might be wondering, when did we lose this pattern? Why do we sleep in one continuous block now instead of two separate sleeps? The answer is light, artificial light. As candles became cheaper and more widely available in the 1700s, and especially as gas lighting and then electric lighting became common in the 18 and 1900s, people started staying up later. Instead of going to bed at 8 or 9 because it was dark and there was nothing else to do, they could read by candlelight, work by lamplight, socialize in brightly lit rooms. Bedtimes got later, midnight, 1 in the morning, even 2, and when you go to bed that late you cannot afford to wake up in the middle of the night for an hour. You need continuous sleep to get enough rest before morning. Factories and industrial work also change things. When you had to be at a factory at a specific time into the morning, when your work was regulated by a clock rather than by natural daylight, you needed a predictable sleep schedule. The flexibility of first sleep and second sleep did not work anymore. And so, over the course of just a few generations, we lost this pattern that had been natural to humans for millennia. We forgot about it so completely that when historians first started finding references to first sleep and second sleep in old texts, they were confused. They thought it must be a metaphor or some kind of specialized terminology, but no, it was just how people slept. And here is what I find both beautiful and sad about this. We lost not just a sleep pattern, but an entire culture of night time. That quiet hour between sleeps was a special time, a liminal space between the business of the day and the deep rest of the night, a time when people could be contemplative, intimate, creative in ways that the harsh light of day did not allow. There are poems written in that hour, prayers composed in that darkness, conversations between spouses that shaped decisions, that healed arguments, that built the kind of deep partnership that can only come from hundreds of nights of whispered confidence. And we have lost it completely. Most modern people have never experienced that natural wake-up in the middle of the night, that feeling of being fully alert and rested, but knowing that more sleep is coming. We think of waking up at 2 a.m. as insomnia, as a problem to be fixed with medication or therapy. But maybe it is not a problem. Maybe it is our bodies trying to return to a pattern that served humanity well for thousands of years. There is a researcher named Roger Ekirch who has studied this extensively. In the 1990s, he published a paper documenting hundreds of references to segmented sleep throughout history. He found mentions in Homer's Odyssey, in Nigerian tribal culture, in French and agricultural manuals, in English legal documents, everywhere he looked. This pattern was universal across cultures and time periods, at least until artificial light changed everything. Ekirch even conducted an experiment. He convinced a group of volunteers to live for a month without artificial light, going to bed shortly after sunset and waking with sunrise. Within a few weeks, almost all of them naturally fell into the two-sleep pattern. They would sleep for a few hours, wake up feeling alert and rested, stay awake for an hour or two, and then fall back asleep until morning. Their bodies remembered something that their conscious minds had forgotten. Now, let us bring this back to Tudor England specifically, because there are some unique aspects of how this culture experienced the night. Church bells rang every hour, every single hour, day and night. You would hear the bell ring once at 1 a.m, twice at 2 a.m, and so on. This was partly to help people tell time, since most people did not own clocks, but it also served as a kind of communal heartbeat, a reminder that you were part of a larger community even in the darkness of night, and people learned to sleep through these bells, or at least to incorporate them into their sleep patterns. You would hear the midnight bell and know that you were in that wakeful period between sleeps. You would hear the 2 a.m. bell and know it was time to settle back down for second sleep. There were also night watchmen in cities and larger towns. These were men who walked the streets calling out the hours and the weather. 2 o'clock and all is well, or 3 o'clock and a foggy morning. Their voices would echo through the quiet streets, letting people know that someone was out there, keeping watch, protecting the community while everyone else slept. Imagine lying in your bed in that wakeful hour between sleeps, hearing the watchman's voice drifting through your window. It must have been comforting in a way, knowing that you were not alone in the darkness, that the world continued even while you rested. But there was also fear in Tudor, in the Tudor night, real fear. Darkness was dangerous. Criminals operated at night, knowing that most people were indoors and the streets were mostly empty. Fires could start and spread quickly through wooden buildings before anyone noticed. Illness could worsen in the night. Death often came in the dark hours before dawn. And then there were the supernatural fears. People genuinely believed in ghosts, demons, witches. The night was when these creatures were thought to be most active. A strange noise could be anything: a cat on the roof, a branch scraping the window, or something far more sinister. So that hour between sleeps, while it could be peaceful and contemplative, could also be a time of anxiety. You might lie there listening to the sounds of the house, trying to determine if that creak was just the building settling or if someone was moving around who should not be. And if you were sick, if you were in pain, that wakeful hour could feel eternal. There was no reaching over to turn on a light, no checking your phone to distract yourself. You just lay there in the darkness, waiting for a second sleep to claim you, hoping that morning would bring relief. But for healthy people, for couples who had found affection in their marriages, for children safe in their parents' home, that hour could be magical. There is something about deep night that makes conversations more honest, that makes people more willing to be vulnerable, to admit fears or hopes they might not voice in daylight. A husband might tell his wife about a business worry that was keeping him awake. A wife might confess her anxiety about an upcoming childbirth. They might make plans for the future, dream about what they hoped their children would become, reminisce about their courtship or early years together. These were the conversations that built marriages. Not the public displays, not the formal ceremonies, but these quiet, dark, intimate exchanges between two people who had chosen to share their lives. And children too experienced this night differently than we do. If you woke between sleeps and were frightened, you did not have your own room to feel alone in. Your parents or siblings were right there, close enough to touch, close enough to whisper to. The darkness was less frightening when you could hear other people breathing, when you knew you were surrounded by family. There was also bundling, that practice we mentioned earlier, where courting couples were put to bed together with a board between them. This often happened during that wakeful hour between sleeps. The young man and woman could talk, could get to know each other, could build the foundation of a relationship that might lead to marriage. It was chaperoned intimacy, supervised romance, but it was intimacy nonetheless. Some historians believe that bundling was specifically timed for the hour between sleeps because that was when young people were most likely to have meaningful conversations. During the day, there were too many distractions, too many other people around. But in the quiet darkness, with the explicit understanding that physical intimacy was forbidden, couples could actually talk to each other. And apparently, despite the board between them and the watchful parents nearby, this worked. Many successful marriages began with bundling. The couples got to know each other's personalities, their values, their hopes and dreams before they ever shared a marriage bed. It is kind of sweet, actually. In a culture that arranged many marriages for political or economic reasons, bundling provided a way for young people to develop genuine affection before being legally bound to each other. But whether you were a courting couple or a long-married pair, whether you were a child whispering to a sibling or a scholar reading by moonlight, that hour between sleeps was a special time. A time that belonged to the night, to quietness, to a kind of intimacy that our always lit, always connected modern world has made almost impossible to achieve. We think we have gained so much with our electric lights and our ability to work or play at any hour, and we have. I'm not suggesting we should give up modern conveniences, but we have also lost something. We have lost the darkness, the real darkness that makes sleep deeper and wakefulness more precious. We have lost the quiet, the profound quiet that lets you hear your own thoughts and your partner's breathing. We have lost the natural rhythm that let our bodies wake and rest according to their own internal patterns rather than alarm clocks and schedules. And maybe, just maybe, we have lost some of the intimacy that came from sharing those dark, quiet hours with the people we loved. But speaking of things we have lost, there is another aspect of Tudor life that is almost incomprehensible to us now. An aspect that involves water, soap, sex, and sin, all tangled together in the most unexpected ways. Because Tudor people had a very complicated relationship with bathing, and what started as a practical way to get clean became deeply entangled with prostitution, disease, and moral panic. That is where we are headed next, into the bathhouses and the stews, where cleanliness and sinfulness met in steamy, scandalous collision. Trust me, you are going to want to hear this story. It involves bishops, brothels, and the surprising connection between laundry and sex work. Stay with me. We are diving into the deep end, and I promise it is going to be fascinating. Walk with me through Southwark in the year 1503. We are crossing London Bridge, leaving the respectable city behind, entering a district that operates under different rules. The air here smells of wood smoke, river water, and something else, something earthy and steamy. We are heading to the bathhouses, or as the locals call them, the stews. And here is the thing that is going to blow your mind. This entire neighbourhood, with its bathhouses and brothels and houses of ill repute, is owned by the Bishop of Winchester. Yes, a bishop, a high-ranking member of the church. The very institution that preaches about chastity and virtue also profits handsomely from the sex trade. Welcome to one of the most hypocritical, fascinating, and utterly human contradictions in Tudor history. Let me set the scene properly, because bathhouses in medieval and early Tudor England were not like modern spas. They were not quiet, peaceful places where you went for a relaxing soak. They were loud, crowded, steamy establishments that served multiple purposes, some of which were decidedly not about getting clean. The bathhouses of Southwark had been operating for centuries. As far back as the 1300s, maybe earlier, this area just south of the river had been London's designated red light district. The city fathers, in their wisdom, decided that if prostitution was going to happen, and it was, it should at least happen outside the city walls where it could be regulated and taxed. And who better to regulate and tax it than the church? Specifically the Bishop of Winchester, who owned most of the land in Southwark. So we end up with this bizarre situation where the women working in these establishments were officially called Winchester geese, a euphemism that acknowledged their connection to the bishop's property, while also allowing everyone to pretend they were not talking about prostitutes. The bathhouses themselves were substantial buildings, usually made of timber and plaster, with large wooden tubs that could accommodate multiple people. The water was heated in cauldrons and poured into the tubs, creating clouds of steam. Herbs were often added to the water, lavender for its scent, rose petals for luxury, sometimes medicinal herbs if someone was trying to treat a skin condition. And yes, people did actually bathe here. Despite what you may have heard about medieval and Tudor people being dirty and never washing, that is largely a myth. They did bathe. Not as frequently as we do, certainly, but they understood the concept of cleanliness. But bathing was communal. Men and women often bathed together, which immediately created opportunities for, shall we say, additional services. There are illustrations from this period showing bathhouses with people of both sexes lounging in the tubs together, some clearly engaging in intimate activities right there in the water. Other illustrations show private rooms off to the side where couples could go for more privacy. The bathhouse was part spa, part social club, part brothel, all operating under the same steamy roof. And the language that evolved around these places is absolutely fascinating. The phrase to lather up became 16th century slang for male ejaculation. Think about that. The act of soaping up, of creating lather in the bath, became a metaphor for sex. That tells you everything you need to know about what was really happening in these establishments. Similarly, stewing in hot water could mean either taking a bath or engaging in prostitution. The words were deliberately ambiguous, allowing people to talk about these places without explicitly acknowledging the sex work that happened there. Now, the women who worked in the stews came from various backgrounds. Some were genuinely washerwomen, laundresses who supplemented their meagre income with sex work. Laundry was back-breaking labour and paid almost nothing. If you could earn extra money by being friendly to customers, well, that might mean the difference between eating and starving. These women became known as lavenders, a term that comes from the Latin word lavare, meaning to wash. Lavender was the herb most commonly used when washing clothes, because it was cheap and readily available throughout Europe. So lavender referred both to the plant and to the women who washed clothes and sometimes sold sex. There is even a poem from this period called The Ship of Fools that includes the lines, "Thou shalt be my lavender, my laundress, without any let. Without any let. Without any hindrance or obstacle. It is barely disguised sexual proposition." But here is what I find interesting. These women were not necessarily outcasts. They were not always desperate or forced into this work. Though certainly some were, many were just trying to survive in an economy that offered women very few legitimate ways to earn money. And society, hypocritical as always, needed them. Men, including married men, including supposedly pious men, visited the bathhouses regularly. They justified it in various ways. It was for their health. It was for cleanliness. It was just what men did. As long as they did not talk about it openly, as long as they maintained a public face of respectability, nobody made too much fuss. Except the church, of course. The church complained constantly about bathhouses and prostitution, preached against them, called them dens of sin, while simultaneously collecting rent from the very establishments they condemned. Can you imagine the mental gymnastics required to maintain that position? To stand in a pulpit on Sunday denouncing sexual immorality while your income depends on the profits from brothels. But it gets even more complicated. Because bathing itself, separate from any sexual connotation, started to fall out of favour during the Tudor period. And the reason why tells us a lot about how medical understanding or misunderstanding shaped intimate life. Around the mid-1500s, physicians began to argue that bathing was actually dangerous. Their reasoning was based on the medical theories of the time, which held that the body had pores that could open and close. A hot bath, they believed, would open these pores wide, making the body vulnerable to disease. They thought that illness was caused by miasma, by bad air that drifted around like invisible fog. If your pores were open from bathing, this bad air could enter your body and make you sick. Therefore, bathing, especially in hot water, was risky. Better to stay dirty and safe than clean and vulnerable. This might sound ridiculous to us, but remember this was before germ theory. They did not know about bacteria or viruses. They were working with the best understanding they had, which happened to be completely wrong. And this wrong understanding had real consequences. As bathing fell out of favour, people relied more on linen undergarments to absorb sweat and keep their outer clothes clean. The wealthy changed their linen shirts daily. The poor changed them weekly if they were lucky. But nobody was washing their bodies with the frequency we would consider normal. Instead, they used perfumes, pomanders, and scented sachets to mask body odour, those elaborate ruffs and collars that we see in Tudor portraits. Part of their function was to hold little bags of lavender or other sweet-smelling herbs close to the face, creating a personal cloud of pleasant scent to cover the smell of unwashed bodies. But back to the bathhouse. As medical opinion turned against bathing, and as Protestant Reformation values emphasised modesty and sexual restraint, the bathhouses came under increasing scrutiny. King Henry VIII, ironically a man not known for sexual restraint, ordered the closure of the Southwark stews in 1546. This was partly for moral reasons, to clean up the city and promote virtue, but it was also practical. Syphilis had arrived in England around 1503, and by the 1540s it was epidemic. The disease was called the French pox, each country blaming it on their neighbours, and it spread rapidly through populations with no understanding of how to prevent or treat it. The bathhouses, where people mingled naked in warm water, where sex work was rampant, were obvious vectors for disease transmission. Closing this seemed like a sensible public health measure. But here is the thing about trying to eliminate prostitution. It does not actually work. It just moves. The women who had worked in the licensed bathhouses of Southwark did not suddenly find respectable employment. They moved to unlicensed establishments, to private rooms, to the streets. The sex trade continued, just with less regulation and less safety for the women involved. And bathing? Well, that declined too. For the next 2 centuries, Europeans bathed infrequently. The wealthy might bathe a few times a year. The poor might never fully immerse themselves in water except by accident. People washed their hands and faces regularly, but full body bathing was rare. This is the origin of those stories about how dirty people were in the past. It is not that they did not understand the concept of cleanliness. They did, but they had been convinced by the medical authorities that bathing was dangerous, and they acted accordingly. There is a wonderful example from the early 1600s of a French gentleman who wrote about visiting England and being shocked by how infrequently English people bathed. He described them as having a peculiar smell, a kind of general unwashed mustiness that he found off-putting. The English, meanwhile, thought the French were ridiculous for bathing so much, exposing themselves to disease for the sake of vanity. Cultural norms around cleanliness vary dramatically across time and place. What seems obviously correct to one generation seems bizarre to the next. Now, there is one more aspect of this bathing story that I need to tell you about, and it involves those laundresses I mentioned earlier. Because while people were bathing less, they were still changing their linen shirts and needing them washed. And that created a huge industry of women who washed clothes for a living. These women worked incredibly hard. They hauled water from wells or rivers, heated it over fires, scrubbed fabric against washboards or stones, wrung out heavy wet garments and spread them to dry. It was exhausting, endless work, and it paid almost nothing. At Hampton Court Palace, there was an entire complex of laundry buildings near the river, where an army of women worked daily washing the household's linens. The court went through vast quantities of linen. Every courtier brought multiple changes of shirts and undergarments. The bed linens needed washing, the table linens, the towels. It was never-ending. And these laundresses, working long hours for low pay, were often assumed to be sexually available. There was a direct association in people's minds between women who washed clothes and women who sold sex. Partly because, as I mentioned, some washerwomen did supplement their income with prostitution, but also because there was something about the work itself, the intimate handling of men's undergarments, the knowledge of their bodies that came from washing their clothes, that seemed vaguely sexual to people. It is absurd when you think about it. These women were doing essential grueling labour, but because that labour involved touching clothing that had been next to naked skin, because it involved washing away the evidence of bodily functions, it was sexualized. And this tells us something important about Tudor attitudes toward bodies and intimacy. Physical intimacy was not just about sex. It extended to anyone who handled your clothing, who touched the things that touched your skin, who saw evidence of your bodily functions. The washerwomen knew things. They knew when a lady's monthly courses came. They knew if a man had nocturnal emissions. They knew if someone was ill from the stains on their shirts. This knowledge, this access to the most private evidence of people's bodies, made them powerful in a way, but also vulnerable to assumptions and accusations. There is a case from 1568 of a laundress who was accused of witchcraft partly because she had handled the clothing of a gentleman who subsequently fell ill. The reasoning was that she must have used those clothes, which carried his sweat and scent, to work a curse on him. She was eventually cleared, but the fact that the accusation was taken seriously tells us how dangerous it could be to have intimate access to people's personal items. The bathhouses might have closed, but the complicated relationship between cleanliness, sex, and sin continued. It just moved to different locations, took different forms. And through it all, women bore the brunt of society's contradictions. They were needed to do the work of washing, of maintaining cleanliness, of providing sexual services that men demanded. But they were also condemned for that very work, seen as morally suspect, sometimes punished for doing exactly what society required them to do. The Bishop of Winchester collected his rents and nobody questioned his piety. The men who visited bathhouses went home to their wives and nobody called them sinners. But the women, the Winchester geese, the lavenders, the washerwomen, they carried the moral burden for everyone. It was unjust then. It is unjust now when we look back on it. But it was also deeply, painfully human. We are very good at creating systems that benefit some people while punishing others, at building social structures that require certain behaviours while condemning the people who perform them. The bathhouses of Southwark are long gone now. The buildings were torn down centuries ago. The women who worked there left no names, no stories, just a few euphemisms in the historical record and some scandalous illustrations in medieval manuscripts. But their lives, their work, their complicated existence at the intersection of necessity and sin. Important about Tudor intimacy. It was never simple. It was never just about private feelings between two people. It was always entangled with economics, with religion, with class, with hypocrisy. The same society that demanded women be chaste created conditions that made prostitution necessary. The same church that preached sexual purity profited from sexual commerce. The same medical establishment that claimed to promote health convinced people that bathing was dangerous. And individuals trying to navigate this maze of contradictions did their best. Some found ways to be genuinely clean despite medical advice against it. Some found love despite marriages arranged for economic reasons. Some found dignity despite working in condemned professions. And now we need to talk about the language they used to discuss all of this, because Tudor people were remarkably creative when it came to talking about sex without actually saying the word sex. They had euphemisms, metaphors, slang that ranged from poetic to absolutely filthy. And the way they talked about bodies, about desire, about the acts themselves, reveals a culture that was simultaneously repressed and remarkably bawdy. That is coming up next. We are diving into the vocabulary of Tudor intimacy, and I promise you some of these phrases are going to make you laugh out loud. Others are going to make you blush. All of them are going to show you a side of Tudor life that rarely makes it into the history books. There is a court record from 1539 that describes two people as hanging by their bellies as sparrows do. Now, if you did not know the context, you might think this is about birds, maybe some charming observation about nature. But no, this is actually a witness describing Catherine Howard and Francis Derham having sex, hanging by their bellies as sparrows. This is how Tudor people talked about intimacy when they had to be somewhat polite about it. And honestly, it is kind of beautiful in its own weird way. They turned one of the most basic human acts into poetry, into metaphor, into imagery that was simultaneously modest and absolutely explicit if you knew what you were hearing. Welcome to the wild, creative, sometimes shocking world of Tudor sexual language. Let me start with the more poetic euphemisms, because these actually tell us something important about how people thought about bodies and desire. Making the beast with two backs was one of Shakespeare's favourites. It appears in Othello, where Iago uses it to describe Othello and Desdemona's presumed intimacy. The image is of two people so closely joined that they appear to be one creature with two backs. It is crude and romantic at the same time, which is very Tudor. Shaking the sheets meant exactly what you think it meant. It referenced the physical activity that would cause bed linens to move and rustle. This phrase appears in numerous court documents, usually when someone is trying to testify that yes, a couple definitely consummated their marriage, because witnesses could hear the sheet shaking in the next room. The Deed of Darkness is another Shakespearean contribution. It emphasized the secretive nighttime nature of sexual activity. This phrase carries moral weight too, suggesting something shameful that must be hidden from the light of day. But it also has a certain dramatic flair that makes it more interesting than just saying sex. Swiving was the most common verb used in everyday speech. It is blunt, Anglo-Saxon, the kind of word you would use in a tavern or a marketplace, not polite, not poetic, just direct. Court records are full of testimonies where witnesses say they saw or heard people swiving. It was the working-class word for the act. No pretension, no metaphor. But here is where things get really interesting. Tudor people had different words for different types of sexual activity, different contexts, different moral judgments attached. Occupation was what happened between husband and wife in the marriage bed. It was legitimate, sanctioned by the church, necessary for procreation. When a priest or doctor talked about marital relations, they called it occupation. It sounds clinical to our ears, almost like a job, which is actually kind of what the church thought it was, a duty, an obligation, an occupation. Fornication was sex between unmarried people. This was sinful, though not as sinful as some other options. Young couples who were planning to marry might fornicate before the wedding, and while the church disapproved, it was not the end of the world, especially if pregnancy resulted and the couple then married quickly. Adultery was sex between at least one married person and someone who was not their spouse. This was serious sin, punishable by church courts, sometimes by secular courts too. It could result in public shaming, fines, even whipping in extreme cases. Adultery threatened the social order because it created doubt about paternity, about inheritance, about the legitimacy of children. And then there was sodomy, which was a catch-all term for any sexual act that could not result in procreation. This included what we would call homosexual activity, but it also included heterosexual acts that were considered unnatural. The definition was deliberately vague, which made it useful for prosecuting anyone whose sexuality seemed threatening to social norms. The language of bodies themselves was equally creative and revealing. Men had stones, or cullions, for testicles. The penis was a yard or a member, or a tool, or my personal favourite, a tallywag. Women's genitals were called quaint or commodity or nature, or simply the placket, which originally meant a slit in a skirt but came to mean, well, another kind of opening. These terms were not just Victorian-style prudishness. They reveal how people thought about bodies, especially about the differences between male and female anatomy. Men's genitals were active, tool-like, something used to accomplish a purpose. The word yard suggests measurement, comparison, a quantifiable thing. Tool is even more explicit about function over form. These were instruments, weapons even, used to achieve the goal of procreation. Women's genitals were described more passively, as containers or commodities or simply as natural spaces. The word quaint is particularly interesting because it could mean both cunning and pleasant, as well as referring to female anatomy. There is a complexity there, a suggestion that female sexuality was mysterious, perhaps dangerous, certainly something that needed to be approached with care. And then there were the codpieces. Oh, the codpieces. If you have ever looked at portraits of Tudor men and wondered about that bulging, sometimes extremely prominent pouch at the front of their hose, that is a codpiece. And it was not just functional, though it did serve the purpose of covering and protecting male genitals. It was a fashion statement, a declaration, an advertisement. Wealthy men had codpieces embroidered with gold thread, studded with jewels, padded to appear even larger than anatomy would suggest. King Henry VIII's armour includes codpieces that are frankly ridiculous in their size and prominence. These were not subtle garments. What was the message being sent? Male fertility, male potency, male power. The bigger your codpiece, the more virile you were presumed to be. It was sexual signalling taken to an absurd extreme, men literally padding their groins to appear more impressive. And yet, at the same time, women were supposed to be modest, to hide their bodies under layers of fabric, to give no hint of what lay beneath. The double standard was built into the clothing itself. But back to language, because there is more we need to explore. Tudor people were obsessed with virginity, particularly female virginity, and they had elaborate ways of talking about it. A virgin was a maid, obviously, but she was also described as having her maidenhead intact. This referred to the hymen, that thin membrane that was thought to prove virginity if it bled when broken during first intercourse. Except, as we discussed earlier, not all women bleed, and the hymen can be broken through activities that have nothing to do with sex. But Tudor people did not know this, or if they suspected it, they could not admit it because the entire social structure depended on being able to verify virginity. So there were tests, humiliating, invasive tests. If a woman's virginity was questioned, especially in cases involving nobility or royalty where inheritance was at stake, midwives or physicians might be called in to perform an examination. They would check for the presence of the hymen, though what exactly they were looking for and how they determined intactness is unclear, and probably varied wildly depending on who was doing the examining. There is a case from 1536 involving Margaret Tudor, the older sister of King Henry VIII. When she wanted to marry for the third time, there were questions about whether her second marriage had been properly annulled. Part of the inquiry involved whether she had maintained her virtue during the annulment proceedings. She was in her 40s at this point, had been married twice before, had children. The idea that her virginity was relevant to anything is absurd. But the language of virginity, of maidenhood, was so powerful that it was invoked even in situations where it made no sense. Now let us talk about pregnancy, because Tudor people had creative ways of discussing this too. A pregnant woman was with child, obviously, but she was also great with child if she was visibly showing. She was in a blessed state if the pregnancy was legitimate and welcomed. She was quick with child once she felt the baby moving. That quickening we talked about earlier, that was the first real proof of pregnancy. But if the pregnancy was illegitimate, if the woman was unmarried, the language changed. She was gotten with child, passive voice, as if pregnancy had been done to her rather than being something she participated in. She was brought to bed before her time, meaning she gave birth before a wedding could happen. She was in trouble, which could mean pregnant or generally in a bad situation, the terms being essentially interchangeable for an unmarried pregnant woman. And the fathers of these illegitimate children, they got a woman with child, or they brought shame upon a maid, active voice. They did something, they were responsible, they caused the situation. Except, of course, in practice it was the woman who bore the consequences. She was the one whose reputation was ruined. She was the one who might be thrown out of her home, who would struggle to find work, who would be marked as immoral for the rest of her life. The man might pay a fine if he was identified, and if he had money. But mostly he would just move on with his life. The language itself embedded these double standards. Men did things to women. Women were passive recipients of male action. Even when describing an act that requires two participants, the grammar made it sound like women were just things that happened to, not people making choices. But women found ways to resist this narrative, to talk about their own experiences in their own terms. We have letters written by women, rare but precious, that describe their bodily experiences in language that claims ownership and agency. Bess of Hardwick, one of the richest women in Tudor England, wrote letters about her pregnancies that are remarkably direct. She talks about her breeding, about feeling the child move, about her concerns and discomforts. She does not use passive language. She is not happening to be pregnant. She is experiencing pregnancy, managing it, preparing for it actively. There are also medical texts written by and for women, though these are even rarer. The Knowing of Woman's Kind in Childing, a Middle English text that circulated in manuscript form, discusses pregnancy and childbirth in language that assumes women as the primary audience. It talks about bodies in practical, unembellished terms. It is not poetic or metaphorical, it is instructional, direct, focused on what women need to know to survive pregnancy and childbirth. And then there is the language of desire itself, which is where things get truly fascinating and complicated. How do you talk about wanting someone sexually in a culture that says desire, especially female desire, is sinful? You find ways to code it, to hide it in plain sight, to say one thing while meaning another. Love letters from this period are masterpieces of subtext. A woman might write to a man that she longs to see him, that his absence causes her pain, that she dreams of their reunion. Is she talking about romantic love or sexual desire? Both? Neither? The ambiguity is intentional, creating plausible deniability while still communicating feeling. Men could be more direct because male desire was considered more natural, less shameful. A husband writing to his wife might say he wishes she were in his bed, as we saw with John Johnson earlier. He could express physical longing without worrying about being judged immoral. But even men had to be careful with language if they were writing to women they were not married to. Courtship required a delicate balance of expressing interest without being so explicit that you cause scandal. And there were formal conventions, learned behaviours about how to talk about bodies and desire in ways that communicated meaning while maintaining deniability. Young people learned these codes from watching others, from reading popular literature, from participating in the social rituals of courtship. The language of flowers, for instance. Giving someone a rose meant one thing, a violet meant another. Herbs had meanings too. Rosemary for remembrance, lavender for devotion, rue for regret. You could send a bouquet that was essentially a coded message about your intentions and feelings. Similarly, there were conventional phrases used in courtship that everyone understood. If a man said a woman had caught his eye, that was innocent enough. If he said she had captured his heart, that was more serious. If he said she had inflamed his passion, well, that was getting into dangerous territory, suggesting physical desire that polite society did not acknowledge. Women had their own coded language. A woman who looked at a man favourably was expressing interest. One who granted him a token of her esteem, perhaps a handkerchief or a ribbon, was signalling willingness to be courted. One who allowed him to attend upon her at social functions was making a public statement about their relationship. All of this language, all of these codes and conventions were necessary because direct, honest communication about bodies and desire was essentially impossible. The social rules were too strict, the consequences for violating them too severe. And yet desire existed, love existed, lust existed. People wanted each other, longed for each other, found ways to be together despite all the barriers society erected. The language they created to navigate this contradiction is remarkable. It is poetry born of necessity, creativity emerging from constraint. They cannot say what they meant actually, so they learned to say it indirectly in ways that were somehow more powerful for being coded. There is something beautiful about that, even as there is something sad. Beautiful that humans are so adaptable, so creative, so determined to express feeling despite restrictions. Sad that those restrictions existed at all, that people could not just say, "I want you," or "I love you," or "let us be together," without fearing judgment or punishment. But the language reveals another truth too. Intimacy is not just physical, it is communication. It is understanding what someone means even when they cannot say it plainly. It is learning to read between lines, to hear what is not spoken, to know someone well enough that you can decode their carefully chosen words. Tudor couples who found genuine love, who built real partnerships, did so partly through developing this shared language, this private code that let them communicate feelings that society said should not exist. And that brings us to something we have not yet fully explored. What happened when desire existed outside the narrow boundaries society prescribed? When people fell in love with the wrong person, or felt attraction that could never be acknowledged, or wanted something that the world said they should not want. Because not all Tudor intimacy fit into neat categories of husbands and wives in marriage beds doing their procreative duty. That is where we are going next, into the complicated, often hidden world of love that did not fit, desire that could not speak its name, and the ways people found to be human even when humanity was forbidden. When Anne Boleyn was awaiting execution in the Tower of London in May of 1536, she asked for one thing. Not mercy, she knew that was impossible. Not a chance to see her daughter Elizabeth. That too was denied. She asked for paper and ink. She wanted to write letters. We do not know who those letters were addressed to. They were never delivered, or if they were, they did not survive. But the fact that in her final days, facing death, Anne wanted to write tells us something profound about the role of written words in Tudor intimacy. Letters were everything. They were the only way to maintain connection across distance, the only way to express feelings that could not be spoken aloud, the only private space in a very public world. And we are so lucky, incredibly lucky, that some of these letters survived, because they let us peek behind the formal facades, behind the painted portraits and official documents, into the actual hearts of people who loved 500 years ago. Let me take you to 1547. King Henry VIII has been dead for a few months. His widow, Catherine Parr, the queen who survived him, has just remarried in secret. Her new husband is Thomas Seymour, the brother of Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife. It is a scandalous match. Catherine was supposed to wait at least a year before remarrying. She has violated protocol, propriety, everything expected of a dowager queen. Why? Because she and Thomas had been in love before she married Henry. They had wanted to marry each other, but Henry wanted Catherine, and when the king wants something, everyone else's desires become irrelevant. So Catherine married Henry, became queen, nursed him through his final years as his health declined and his temper grew worse. And all that time she and Thomas wrote to each other. Carefully coded letters, nothing explicitly romantic, nothing that could be used against them if discovered. But underneath the proper language there was longing. There was the grief of separation. There was the careful preservation of a connection that had to remain hidden. When Henry finally died, Catherine and Thomas married within months. Scandal erupted, but they did not care. They had waited years. They had earned their chance at happiness. Catherine wrote to Thomas in one of the few surviving letters from their marriage, "I would not have you think that this mine honest good will toward you to proceed from any sudden motion or passion. For as truly as God is God, my mind was fully bent, the other time I was at liberty, to marry you before any man I know." Read that again. Before any man I know. She is telling him that when she was free and before Henry claimed her, Thomas was her choice, her first choice, her only choice. And she has carried that knowledge with her through years of being someone else's wife, of sleeping in someone else's bed, of performing someone else's version of intimacy. And now, finally she can say it. She can choose him. They can be together. This is romance. Real romance. Not the sanitized, simplified version we see in movies. Not love at first sight or grand gestures. This is two people who chose each other, lost each other to circumstance and power, and found their way back. And they did it through letters, through written words that could be hidden, carried close to the heart, read and reread in private moments. Letters were the lifeline of Tudor relationships, especially for the wealthy and educated who were often separated by duty, politics, or war. We talked earlier about John Johnson, the merchant in Calais, and his wife Sabine in England. Their letters are remarkable not just for what they say, but for how they say it. They are business letters and love letters simultaneously. John discusses wool prices and shipping schedules, and then he slips in a line about wishing Sabine were there with him, about missing her voice, about longing for her presence. Sabine writes back about managing his estates, about dealing with difficult tenants, about financial accounts, and then she signs herself your loving wife in a way that is both formal convention and genuine expression of feeling. These letters reveal marriages that were partnerships. Economic partnerships, yes, but also emotional ones. These couples relied on each other, trusted each other's judgment, valued each other's opinions. And here is what strikes me most. The women in these letters are not passive. They're not waiting demurely for their husbands to return. They're running businesses, managing properties, making decisions. Joan Thynne, who we mentioned before, wrote letters to her husband John that are essentially instructions. She tells him how to handle family politics, how to pursue advancement at court, which alliances to cultivate. And John listened. He valued her advice. His replies show that he took her suggestions seriously, that he saw her as a capable partner whose intelligence was an asset to their shared ambitions. This was not universal, obviously. Many marriages were unhappy, many women were treated as property rather than partners. But these letters proved that love was possible, that genuine partnership could exist within the constraints of Tudor society. Now, let us talk about a different kind of letter. The kind that was never meant to be preserved, that was probably supposed to be burned after reading, but somehow survived anyway. In 1533, King Henry VIII wrote a series of letters to Anne Boleyn while they were courting. These letters are extraordinary because Henry was not a man who revealed vulnerability easily. He was a king. He was supposed to be above personal feeling, guided only by duty and political necessity. But in these letters, he is almost pathetic in his need. He writes that he cannot sleep for thinking of her, that her absence causes him physical pain, that he is struck with the dart of love and cannot rest until she agrees to be his. One letter includes a drawing. Henry drew a heart with the initials AB inside it. The King of England, the most powerful man in the country, reduced to doodling like a lovesick teenager. It is humanizing in a way that almost makes you forget what Henry became later, what he did to Anne, how he had her executed when she could not give him a son. These letters were written by a man who believed himself genuinely in love, and maybe he was, in his own limited, selfish way. But love, real love, requires more than passion. It requires constancy. It requires treating the other person as a person, not as a means to an end. And Henry failed that test spectacularly. Anne's replies to these letters, if she wrote any, did not survive. Or perhaps she destroyed them, knowing even then that written evidence of her relationship with the king could be dangerous. We will never know what she thought, what she felt, whether she loved him back or simply saw an opportunity to rise higher than any woman in her family had risen before. What we do know is that 3 years after their marriage, Anne was dead, and Henry moved on to Jane Seymour without apparent grief or regret. So much for the dart of love. But not all Tudor romances ended in tragedy. There were couples who found genuine happiness, whose letters revealed decades of affection and partnership. William Cecil, Lord Burghley, one of the most powerful men in Elizabethan England, wrote tender letters to his wife Mildred throughout their marriage. He called her his dear heart and his only joy. When he was away on government business, which was often, he wrote to her about both important matters and small domestic details. He asked about her health, about the children, about household matters. He shared his worries about political situations, asked for her thoughts and advice. These were not the letters of a man who saw his wife as decoration or breeding stock. These were the letters of a man who genuinely valued his spouse as a companion and confidant. And Mildred wrote back in kind. Her letters show a woman who was educated, opinionated, and unafraid to express her views. She gave William advice on everything from politics to personal conduct. She managed their household and estates with skill and authority. Their marriage lasted over 40 years. 40 years of partnership, of mutual respect, of genuine affection that deepened over time rather than fading. This is the kind of marriage that rarely makes it into dramatic retellings of Tudor history. It is not scandalous enough, not tragic enough, not exciting enough, but it was real, and it mattered to the people living it. Letters also reveal the importance of small gestures in maintaining connection. Couples who were separated sent each other tokens, a lock of hair, a piece of ribbon, a ring. These items were carried close to the body, worn under clothing, kept in pockets or purses. There is something deeply touching about imagining a Tudor husband reaching into his doublet to touch a ribbon his wife had worn, a physical reminder of her presence when she was hundreds of miles away, or a wife wearing a ring her husband had sent, turning it on her finger as she wrote to him by candlelight. These tokens were not just romantic gestures, they were anchors, reminders that there was someone who cared, someone waiting, someone who made the separation and the loneliness worthwhile. And for couples who were not separated by distance but by circumstance, who lived in the same house but had no real privacy, letters could serve a different purpose. They could say things that could not be spoken aloud, with servants nearby, with children underfoot, with the constant interruptions of daily life. A husband might leave a note for his wife, hidden in her prayer book or tucked into her sewing basket, just a few lines expressing affection, appreciation, desire. She would find it hours later, in a quiet moment, and smile. Or a wife might write to her husband about something that was bothering her, something she found difficult to say face to face. The written word created distance that made vulnerability safer. This practice of writing notes to each other, even when living in the same house, might seem odd to us. Why not just talk? But remember, privacy was rare. Genuine private conversation was almost impossible. A letter could be read in solitude, could be kept and cherished, could express things that the speaker might not be brave enough to say while looking someone in the eyes. The rise of literacy during the Tudor period made all of this possible in ways it had not been before. The Protestant Reformation's emphasis on reading the Bible, combined with the availability of printed books, led to a massive increase in literacy rates. More people could read, more people could write, and that meant more people could maintain relationships through written correspondence. Women's literacy especially increased during this period. While still not universal, it was no longer unusual for a gentlewoman to be able to read and write. Some women were highly educated, reading Latin and Greek, studying theology and philosophy, and this education gave them tools for self-expression that previous generations had lacked. They could write about their lives, their thoughts, their feelings. They could participate in intellectual discourse. They could maintain friendships and family connections across vast distances through regular correspondence. There is a woman named Lady Anne Clifford who kept a diary throughout her adult life. Her entries are not just about major events, but about daily life, about her relationships, about her thoughts and feelings. She writes about missing her mother, about conflicts with her husband, about the loneliness of being separated from her children. Reading her diary is like having a conversation across 400 years. She becomes real in a way that portraits and official documents never capture. You can hear her voice, sense her personality, understand her struggles, and this is what letters and diaries gave Tudor people. A voice that could carry across time and distance, a way to preserve themselves, their experiences, their loves and losses and daily mundanities. Not everyone had this opportunity. The poor, the illiterate, the people whose lives left no written record, they loved too. They wrote no letters because they could not write. But they found other ways to express affection, to maintain bonds, to build lives together. Oral traditions, songs, folk customs, these were the literacy of people who could not read or write. A song passed down through generations, a traditional blessing spoken at a wedding, a folk tale about true love overcoming obstacles. These were how ordinary people expressed and preserved their understanding of romance and relationship. We have lost most of these oral traditions. They existed in spoken form, passed from person to person, and when the people who knew them died, the traditions died too. What we have are fragments, hints in legal records or complaints from clergy about improper songs being sung at festivals. But those fragments suggest that love, desire, romance, partnership, all of these existed at every level of society, not just among the literate elite whose letters survived, but among everyone. A farmer who could not write still loved his wife, still found ways to show affection, still built a life of shared labour and mutual support. A kitchen maid who could not read still had feelings, still experienced desire, still hoped for connection and companionship. Their stories are mostly lost to us, but they existed. They mattered. They were just as real, just as important as the romances of queens and nobles. And that brings us to something we need to acknowledge. Not all love in Tudor England fit into the sanctioned boxes. Not all desire was between husband and wife. Not all intimacy was heterosexual, procreative, approved by church and society. But people still loved. They still desired. They still found ways to be together, to express feeling, to build lives that made sense to them even if they made no sense to anyone else. And that is where we are going next, into the hidden corners of Tudor intimacy, the relationships that had to stay secret, the desires that could not speak their names, the ways people found to be human even when society told them their humanity was wrong. This is going to be a difficult conversation in some ways. The evidence is scarce, the silences are loud, and we have to be careful not to project modern identities onto historical people who would not have understood themselves in those terms. But the evidence exists, and it matters, because love has always been complicated, has always defied neat categories, has always found ways to flourish even in the harshest climates. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You are a woman in 1528. You have missed your monthly courses for perhaps 6 weeks, maybe 8. You think you might be pregnant, but you cannot be sure. There are no tests you can take, no strips you can check, no blood work that will give you a definitive answer. Your breasts feel tender. You've been nauseous in the mornings. You feel tired in a way that goes beyond normal fatigue. But all of these symptoms could mean other things. Illness, poor diet, stress, the humoral imbalance that physicians are always talking about. So you wait. You wait for the one sign that will prove beyond any doubt that you are carrying a child. You wait for the quickening. This is the moment. Usually around 4 to 5 months into pregnancy when you first feel the baby move inside you. A flutter at first like a butterfly trapped under your skin. Then stronger movements, unmistakable, undeniable. Kicks and rolls and what feels like somersaults happening inside your own body. Only when you feel this quickening can you be certain. Only then does pregnancy transform from suspicion to fact. Only then do you tell your husband, your family, your community. Only then do you begin preparing for the birth that will come in another 4 or 5 months. This is how it worked in Tudor England, and it shaped everything about how people understood pregnancy, life, and even the soul itself. Let me explain why the quickening mattered so much, because this goes deeper than just medical uncertainty. The Catholic Church, and later the Protestant churches, taught that the soul entered the body at the moment of quickening, not at conception, not at birth, but at that precise instant when the mother first felt movement. Before quickening, you were pregnant with potential. After quickening, you carried a living soul. This belief had enormous practical implications. If a woman miscarried before quickening, it was sad but not spiritually catastrophic. The pregnancy had not yet become a person. There was grief, certainly, but not the same kind of loss as losing a baby after quickening or after birth. But if a woman miscarried after quickening, if she felt the baby move and then lost it, that was the death of a soul. That required mourning, burial rites, prayers for the departed spirit. It was a fundamentally different kind of tragedy. And this is why those early months of pregnancy were so strange and liminal. You might suspect you were pregnant. You might even be fairly certain. But until quickening, you could not know for sure, and neither could anyone else. This created opportunities for deception and confusion that we can barely imagine today. A woman who wanted to hide a pregnancy could often do so until quickening. The clothing of the period, with its layers and its looseness, concealed changes in the body remarkably well. If she said nothing, if she bound her belly, if she was careful, she might keep the secret for 4 or 5 months. Why would a woman want to hide pregnancy? Well, if she was unmarried, obviously. An illegitimate pregnancy meant shame, loss of reputation, possibly being thrown out of her home. Some women hid pregnancies until the last possible moment, hoping to find a solution, to persuade the father to marry them, or simply to delay the inevitable reckoning. There are court cases of women who gave birth in secret, sometimes in fields or barns, sometimes with the help of a friend or an older woman who knew how to keep secrets. These babies, if they survived, might be left at a church door or at the home of a wealthy family, hoping someone would take them in. Or the woman might try to conceal the birth itself, hiding the baby's body if it died, or if she, in desperation, did something terrible. There are heartbreaking cases of young servants who gave birth alone in attics or outbuildings, terrified of being discovered, and the baby died either from complications or from the mother's fear and confusion. These stories are dark, I know, but they are part of the reality of a world where pregnancy could destroy a woman's life if it happened at the wrong time. But quickening could also be used to establish legitimacy. If a woman was widowed, or if her husband had been away, and there was question about whether a child she was carrying was his, she might testify that she felt quickening before he died or before he left. This proved the pregnancy had begun while they were together, which legitimized the child's claim to inheritance. There are legal records of women being questioned closely about exactly when they felt quickening, what it felt like, whether they were certain it was the baby and not just indigestion or gas. Their testimony could determine whether a child inherited property, titles, even thrones. Now, you might be wondering about those unreliable pregnancy tests I mentioned earlier. Because Tudor people did try to determine pregnancy before quickening, they just did not have methods that actually worked. The most common test was examining urine. Physicians would look at the colour and consistency. If it was pale, almost white with a cloudy appearance that supposedly indicated pregnancy. Some physicians claimed they could smell pregnancy in urine, detecting a sweetish odour. None of this worked, of course. Urine colour and smell are affected by diet, hydration, health conditions, all sorts of things that have nothing to do with pregnancy. There were other tests too. Mix the woman's urine with wine. If it stays clear, she is pregnant. If it becomes cloudy, she is not. Or put a needle in the urine overnight. If it rusts, pregnancy. If it stays shiny, no pregnancy. Again, completely useless, but people were desperate for answers, for some way to know before waiting months for quickening. Some women consulted wise women or cunning folk, people in the community who claimed special knowledge of herbs and bodies. These practitioners might feel the woman's pulse, examine her eyes, ask detailed questions about symptoms. Some genuinely had accumulated practical knowledge from experience. Others were charlatans taking advantage of desperation, and some of their methods bordered on the bizarre. There is a remedy book from the early 1500s that suggests a woman should urinate on wheat and barley seeds. If the seeds sprout within a few days, she is pregnant. If not, she is not. Interestingly, this method has a tiny grain of actual science behind it. Pregnant women's urine does contain hormones that can affect plant growth, but the test is far too unreliable to be useful. Still, it shows that people were observing, experimenting, trying to find patterns even if they did not understand the mechanisms. But for most women, in most cases, the only reliable indicator was quickening, and the wait for it must have been agonizing. Imagine wanting to be pregnant, hoping for a child and having to wait months before you could be sure. Every day checking for that flutter, that movement, praying it would come. Or imagine fearing pregnancy, dreading it, and spending those same months in anxious uncertainty, hoping that the missed courses were just a temporary disruption, that the nausea would pass, that there was no baby growing inside you. And then, one day you feel it. That unmistakable sensation of another being moving inside your body, and everything changes. Your suspicions are confirmed, your fears or hopes are realized. You are definitely, certainly, indisputably pregnant. What did that moment feel like? We have some descriptions, though not as many as I would like. Women described it as a fluttering like a bird's wings. Some said it felt like bubbles rising inside them. Others compared it to the feeling of butterflies in the stomach, except lower, deeper, more insistent. And most women, once they felt it, became instantly protective. This was no longer an abstract possibility. This was their child moving and alive inside them. The bond that would last the rest of their lives began in that moment of quickening. But quickening also marked the beginning of serious danger. Because now the pregnancy was undeniable, public, and the countdown to birth had begun. And birth, as we have discussed, was one of the most dangerous events in a Tudor woman's life. Statistics are difficult to pin down for this period, but historians estimate that somewhere between 10 and 25 women out of every 100 died in childbirth or from complications in the weeks afterward. That is a staggering number. It means that every pregnant woman knew she was taking a real risk with her life. This is why women wrote their wills during pregnancy. Not if they felt ill or if something seemed wrong, but as a standard practice. Getting pregnant meant preparing for the possibility of death. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine being happy about expecting a child while simultaneously writing instructions for who should get your possessions, who should care for your other children, how your funeral should be conducted? These wills are heartbreaking to read. Women leaving instructions for their daughters' weddings, hoping they would live to see them, but knowing they might not. Women asking that their favourite ring be given to their sister, their prayer book to their mother, their household linen to their eldest daughter. Some women wrote letters to their unborn children, to be opened if the mother died in childbirth. These letters offered advice, expressed love, tried to create some connection between mother and child even if they would never meet. A woman named Elizabeth Jocelyn wrote such a letter in 1622, just outside our Tudor period, but in that same tradition. She was pregnant with her first child and convinced she would die in childbirth. She wrote a letter to the baby full of advice about how to live a good Christian life, how to honour her father, how to be virtuous and kind. Elizabeth did die 9 days after giving birth to a daughter. The daughter grew up reading that letter, knowing her mother's thoughts, her hopes, her love, expressed from beyond the grave. This was the shadow that hung over every pregnancy, joy mixed with fear, hope tempered by realistic assessment of risk. And the risks were real. Women died from hemorrhage when the placenta detached too early or did not deliver completely. They died from infections that set in after birth, fevers that raged through their bodies while physicians had no effective treatments. They died from obstructed labour when the baby was too large or positioned wrong, and there was no safe way to perform a caesarean section on a living mother. Midwives did their best. They had techniques, accumulated knowledge, practical skills that saved many lives, but they were working without understanding of germ theory, without antibiotics, without the ability to perform surgery safely. So women prayed. They wore amulets and charms. They invoked saints, especially Saint Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth. They borrowed that sacred girdle from Westminster Abbey if they had the connections and the money. They surrounded themselves with other women who had survived birth, hoping their presence would bring luck and protection, and they waited for labour to begin, knowing that when it did, they would be entering a trial that might kill them. But here is something remarkable. Despite this very real danger, despite the statistics, most women survived. 75 to 90% made it through childbirth alive. That is still a horrifying mortality rate by modern standards, but it means that more women survived than died, and those who survived often did so multiple times. Having one baby successfully did not mean you were done with the risk. If you had 5 children, you faced that danger 5 times. 10 children, 10 times rolling the dice hoping your luck would hold. Some women had 7, 8, 10 children and survived every birth. Others died with their first. There was no way to predict, no way to know if you would be lucky or unlucky. What we can know is that the women who lived through this were incredibly strong. Physically strong, certainly, but also mentally strong, emotionally resilient. They faced down death repeatedly and kept going, kept having children, kept building their lives. And the babies themselves, those who survived birth, faced their own dangers. Infant mortality was even higher than maternal mortality. Roughly a quarter of babies died in their first year. Another quarter died before reaching age 5. This meant that most parents buried at least one child, often more. The grief of child loss was a nearly universal experience, and yet people loved their children, deeply, fiercely, completely. The idea that medieval and Tudor parents did not bond with their children because death was so common is a myth. They loved their babies just as much as parents love babies today. The difference is they had to love them while knowing the odds of losing them were terrifyingly high. There are letters from fathers mourning dead children, mothers commissioning memorial portraits, families preserving locks of hair, tiny shoes, baptismal gowns. These were not people who treated their children as disposable or inevitable losses. These were people who loved and grieved with the same intensity that humans have always loved and grieved. The quickening was the beginning of this journey, the moment when hope and fear crystallized into certainty, when a woman knew she was carrying a life that might or might not survive, that might cost her own life in the bringing forth. And yet they did it. They felt that first flutter of movement and embraced it, prepared for it, walked toward birth with courage that I find almost incomprehensible. Because they wanted children, they wanted families, they wanted the future that babies represented, even knowing the cost might be unbearably high. And now we need to talk about what happened when those babies arrived. When the quickening gave way to labour and birth brought a new person into the world. We need to understand what it meant to be a royal mother whose womb shaped history, whose ability or inability to produce male heirs determined the fates of nations. Because the most intimate act, the most private biological function, became the most public concern when it happened to queens. And the pressure, the scrutiny, the absolute stakes of royal childbearing created tragedies that echo through history. That is where we turn next, into the terrible weight of royal wombs and the women who carried the future of England inside their bodies. Catherine of Aragon was pregnant at least 6 times, possibly more. We know of 6 confirmed pregnancies, but there may have been others, early miscarriages that went unrecorded, losses that happened before anyone outside her immediate circle even knew she was carrying a child. Of those 6 pregnancies, only 1 child survived past infancy, a daughter, Mary. And that single biological fact, that terrible record of loss and failure to produce a living son, would reshape the entire religious landscape of England, would lead to the break with Rome, would result in Catherine's own divorce and exile, would set in motion events that would kill thousands and change the course of Western civilization. All because a woman's body could not or would not do what her husband and her kingdom demanded. This is the reality of being a royal woman in Tudor England. Your womb was not your own. It belonged to the state, to the dynasty, to history itself. And if it failed to perform its singular essential function, you paid the price with everything you had. Let me walk you through Catherine's pregnancies, because each one tells a story of hope and heartbreak, of mounting pressure and desperate prayer. First pregnancy, 1510. Catherine gives birth to a stillborn daughter. The baby is perfectly formed but never draws breath. Catherine is 24 years old, newly married to Henry, who is 18. There is disappointment but not panic. She is young. There will be other chances. Second pregnancy, 1511. A son. Henry is born on New Year's Day, and England erupts in celebration. Bonfires are lit. Bells ring throughout the city. Henry names the baby after himself, calls him the New Year's boy, orders tournaments and feasts. For 52 days there is a male heir. Then the baby dies. Just dies suddenly, possibly from infection, or some congenital condition they could not detect. Catherine is devastated. Henry is bewildered. How could this happen? They did everything right. They prayed, they followed all the advice, and still the baby died. Third pregnancy, probably late 1513 or early 1514. Miscarriage, we do not have details. The records just note that the Queen was with child, but that nothing came of it. Fourth pregnancy, late 1514. Another son born in December. This time he lives only hours, maybe a day, not long enough to even be properly christened. Fifth pregnancy, 1518. Another daughter stillborn. Catherine is now 33 years old. She has been trying for 8 years to give Henry a living son. 8 years of pregnancy, labour, loss, grief, recovery, trying again. Her body has been through trauma that we can barely comprehend. And then, in 1516, between these recorded pregnancies, Mary is born. A healthy baby girl who survives, who grows into childhood, adolescence, adulthood, who will eventually become Queen Mary I. But she is not a son, and that is all that matters to Henry. Sixth pregnancy, possibly 1518 or 1519. Another miscarriage, and after this, nothing. Catherine stops getting pregnant. Whether because of her age, because her body has been damaged by the previous pregnancies, or because Henry stopped sleeping with her, we cannot know for certain. But the pregnancies end, and with them Catherine's value as a wife. By 1527, Henry is actively seeking an annulment. He argues that his marriage to Catherine was never valid because she had been married to his brother Arthur first. He claims that God is punishing him for this sin by denying him sons. He needs a new wife who can give him male heirs. Catherine fights back. She testifies under oath that her marriage to Arthur was never consummated, that she came to Henry as a virgin, that their marriage is legitimate. But it does not matter. Henry wants out, and eventually he will get what he wants by breaking with the Catholic Church and establishing himself as the head of a new Church of England. Catherine is divorced, exiled, forbidden from seeing her daughter. She dies in 1536, possibly of cancer, possibly of a broken heart. Her last words are a letter to Henry, still calling him her beloved husband, still professing her love. And all of this, every bit of this tragedy, traces back to those pregnancies, to the fact that her womb could not produce what was demanded of it. Now let us talk about Anne Boleyn, the woman Henry married hoping for better luck. Anne gets pregnant quickly after their marriage in 1533. Good sign, everyone thinks. She is young, healthy, certainly fertile, this will work out. She gives birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. The future Elizabeth I, one of England's greatest monarchs. But at the time, massive disappointment. Another girl, not what Henry needs. Anne promises him sons. She gets pregnant again in 1534, miscarriage, gets pregnant again in 1535. Miscarriage, gets pregnant again in early 1536. This is the one we mentioned earlier, the deformed fetus, the miscarriage that may have sealed her fate. 3 pregnancies after Elizabeth, 3 losses, no living sons. And in May of 1536, Anne is arrested, tried for adultery and treason, and executed. Her real crime? The same as Catherine's. Failure to produce a male heir. But here is what makes this even more tragic. We now know that the sex of a child is determined by the father's contribution, not the mother's. Catherine and Anne were not failing to produce sons. Henry was failing to provide the right chromosomes. He was the biological reason for all these daughters and miscarriages. But in 1536, nobody knew that. They thought it was the woman's fault, the woman's failure, the woman's flaw. And women paid the price for this misunderstanding with their lives, their freedom, their happiness. Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife, finally gives him a living son. Edward, born in October 1537. The kingdom rejoices. Jane has done it. She has provided the male heir. She is the good queen, the successful queen, the one who accomplished what Catherine and Anne could not. 12 days later, Jane is dead, probably from infection, from what we now call puerperal fever, caused by bacteria entering the uterus during or after childbirth. Her death is slow, agonizing. She develops a fever, becomes delirious, dies in terrible pain. Did the physicians attending her cause the infection through poor hygiene? Probably. Did the elaborate rituals of royal birth, with dozens of people coming in and out of the lying-in chamber, increase the risk of contamination? Almost certainly. Jane died because she succeeded, because she gave birth to a son and her body paid the ultimate price. Think about that for a moment. Catherine and Anne were destroyed for failing to produce sons. Jane died from succeeding. There was no winning position for a royal woman whose value was measured entirely by her reproductive capacity. And young Prince Edward, the son for whom Jane died, for whom Henry had divorced Catherine and executed Anne, he would die at age 15, having ruled for only 6 years, his weak constitution possibly a result of being born to an exhausted mother who had endured a difficult pregnancy and labour. The male heir that cost so much would not even survive to adulthood. But in 1537 nobody knew that yet. All anyone knew was that finally England had a legitimate male heir, the succession was secure, the Tudor dynasty would continue through the male line. Except it would not. When Edward died in 1553, the crown would pass first to Mary, Catherine's daughter, then to Elizabeth, Anne's daughter. Those disappointing girls that everyone had dismissed as failures would end up ruling England, and one of them would preside over a golden age. But I am getting ahead of the story. Let us go back to that moment when Jane died, when Henry mourned briefly and then started looking for his next wife. He married 3 more times. Anne of Cleves, a marriage that was annulled after 6 months, unconsummated because Henry found her unattractive. Catherine Howard, young and vivacious, who he adored until he discovered she had sexual experience before their marriage and possibly adultery after, leading to her execution in 1542. And finally Catherine Parr, the widow who outlived him. Neither Catherine Howard nor Catherine Parr produced children with Henry. Whether because he was no longer capable, or because they used herbs to prevent pregnancy, or simply because of age and declining health on both sides, we cannot know. But the desperation for sons, the obsession with male heirs, that never left Henry. Even as his health failed, even as he grew fat and sick and difficult, he still believed that his legacy depended on having sons to continue his line. And what did this obsession cost? Let me count. 2 wives executed, 1 divorced and exiled, multiple miscarriages and stillbirths, 1 wife dead from childbirth complications, countless women's bodies put through pregnancy after pregnancy, loss after loss, the break with Rome and the religious turmoil that followed, the dissolution of the monasteries, the persecution of Catholics under Edward, and Protestants under Mary, wars, rebellions, thousands of deaths. All because one man could not accept that maybe, just maybe, having daughters was perfectly fine. That women could rule as effectively as men. That the sex of your children did not determine your worth or God's favour. But it was not just Henry's obsession, it was the entire system. The law, the church, the political structure all insisted that male heirs were essential. That only sons could inherit, could rule, could continue dynasties. Women internalized this message. They truly believed that their purpose was to produce sons. When they failed, they felt they had failed at the one thing that mattered. There is a letter from Catherine of Aragon to Henry after one of her miscarriages, where she apologizes. She begs his forgiveness for disappointing him. She promises to do better next time. She blames herself completely. Reading that letter is heartbreaking. Here is a woman who has done nothing wrong, whose body has experienced trauma and loss, and she is apologizing for it. She is taking responsibility for something entirely beyond her control. And Henry, to his credit or not, depending on how generous you want to be, wrote back with words of comfort. He told her not to distress herself, that there would be other chances, that he still loved her, but that comfort would not last. Eventually his patience would run out. Eventually the need for sons would override any affection he felt. Eventually Catherine would be cast aside for a younger woman who might succeed where she had failed. This is what royal pregnancy meant in Tudor England. It was not a private joy or a personal experience. It was a political act with enormous consequences. Every pregnancy was watched, monitored, discussed. Every symptom was analysed. Every kick felt by the Queen was reported to the King and his counsellors. And when birth came, it was a public event. We talked about the lying-in chamber, how the Queen was sealed away with her ladies. But the birth itself had witnesses. The sex of the baby had to be verified immediately. If it was a boy, messengers would be sent racing across the country to spread the news. Bonfires would be lit, celebrations organised. If it was a girl, polite acknowledgement, subdued congratulations, and underneath disappointment, anxiety about what would happen next. Mary Tudor, when she was born, was acknowledged as heir to the throne because she was the only surviving legitimate child. But everyone knew she was a placeholder. If a son came later, he would supersede her. Her position was always temporary, always contingent on her father's continued failure to produce a boy, and this shaped Mary's entire life. She grew up knowing she was seen as second best, as a disappointment. When her parents' marriage fell apart and she was declared illegitimate, stripped of her title, forced to serve in her half-sister Elizabeth's household, it must have seemed like confirmation of what she had always suspected, that she was not good enough, not wanted, not valued. Is it any wonder that Mary's reign was marked by such insecurity, such desperate need to prove herself? She had spent her whole life being told she was inadequate simply because of her sex. Elizabeth at least had the advantage of never being expected to produce heirs herself. She was the last of her line. When she chose not to marry, when she declared herself married to England, she was breaking the pattern that had destroyed her mother and tormented her half-sister. Elizabeth understood that for royal women, marriage and pregnancy were traps. They made you vulnerable, they gave men power over you, they could kill you through childbirth or through political machinations if you failed to produce the right kind of children. So she refused. She kept her body her own. She died childless and unmarried, and the Tudor dynasty ended with her. But she also died free from the reproductive demands that had killed or ruined so many women before her. And maybe that is the final lesson of Tudor royal fertility, that women were damned either way. If they produced sons, they might die in childbirth or be discarded once they had served their purpose. If they produced only daughters, or if they could not get pregnant at all, they would be blamed, punished, replaced. The only way to win was not to play, and Elizabeth was the only one who figured that out. But while royal wombs shaped grand politics and religious upheaval, there was one more transformation happening in Tudor England that would change intimacy forever. A transformation in belief, in practice, in the very structure of how people related to God and to each other. The Reformation was not just about theology. It was about privacy, about individual conscience, about the slow erosion of communal religious life and the rise of personal, private spirituality. And that shift would change everything about how people experienced intimacy, both physical and emotional. That is where we finish this journey, in the complicated space where religion and intimacy intersect, where the Reformation rewrote the rules of private life. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in 1517, he probably was not thinking about what would happen in English bedrooms. He was concerned with theology, with the sale of indulgences, with corruption in the Catholic Church. But the Reformation he sparked would reach into the most intimate corners of people's lives, changing not just what they believed, but how they loved, how they married, how they understood their own bodies and desires. Let me show you what I mean. Before the Reformation, if you were a Catholic in England, you went to confession. You knelt in a booth or before a priest and you told him your sins, all of them, including the sexual ones. Especially the sexual ones, because the church was deeply concerned with regulating sexuality. You confessed that you had slept with your wife on a Sunday, that you had felt desire for someone who was not your spouse, that you had touched yourself, that you had thoughts, urges, feelings that you knew were sinful, and the priest, who had heard it all before, would give you penance. Say 10 Hail Marys, fast for 3 days, make a donation to the church, your sins would be absolved and you could start fresh. This system meant that the most private aspects of your life, your sexual thoughts and behaviours, were known to someone else. The priest held your secrets. He knew things about you that nobody else knew, sometimes things your own spouse did not know. But confession also provided a release valve. You could admit your failures, receive forgiveness and move on. The guilt did not have to accumulate forever. There was a mechanism for dealing with it. Then came the Reformation. And in Protestant theology there was no confession, no intermediary between you and God. You had a direct relationship with the divine. Your sins were between you and your conscience and God alone. This sounds liberating, right? No more having to tell a priest about your private failings. No more public penance. Just you and me. But it also meant that there was nowhere to put the guilt. No ritual for releasing it. No external absolution. You carried your sins alone, worked through them alone, sought forgiveness alone. And this fundamentally changed the nature of privacy and intimacy. Think about it. In the Catholic system, at least one other person knew your secrets, but that knowledge was contained by the seal of confession. The priest could never reveal what you told him. Your secrets were safe even as they were shared. In the Protestant system, your secrets were yours alone, complete privacy, but also complete isolation with your guilt and shame. This shift toward individual conscience, toward private relationship with God, created a new kind of interior life. People became more introspective, more concerned with their own thoughts and motivations. The idea of privacy, of an inner self that belonged to you alone, gained spiritual significance. But the Reformation changed more than just confession. It changed marriage itself. In Catholic theology, marriage was a sacrament, a holy mystery on the same level as baptism or communion. It could not be dissolved except in the most extreme circumstances, and even then only with papal dispensation. Protestant reformers, especially Luther and later Calvin, argued that marriage was not a sacrament. It was a covenant, yes, a serious commitment, absolutely, but it was a civil contract, not a divine mystery. This opened up the possibility of divorce in ways that had never existed before. Now, do not get too excited. Divorce was still difficult, still scandalous, still rare. But the theological foundation had shifted. If marriage was a contract rather than a sacrament, then it could be broken under certain circumstances. Adultery, desertion, irreconcilable differences, though that last one would take centuries to be widely accepted. In England specifically, Henry VIII's break with Rome meant that marriage law fell under the jurisdiction of the English crown rather than the Pope. The king could grant annulments, could make or break marriages, could change the rules to suit political needs. This did not help most ordinary people. They still needed expensive lawyers and powerful connections to end unwanted marriages. But it did mean that marriage was no longer quite so absolutely permanent. There was a crack in the wall, a possibility of escape that had not existed before. The Reformation also changed attitudes toward clergy and celibacy. Catholic priests took vows of chastity. They were supposed to be celibate, married to the church rather than to any earthly spouse. This was the ideal. Though as we have seen with the Bishop of Winchester and his profitable brothels, practice often differed from theory. Protestant reformers rejected clerical celibacy entirely. Luther himself, a former monk, married a former nun named Katharina von Bora. They had 6 children together and by all accounts had a happy, affectionate marriage. This was revolutionary. It said that clergy were not spiritually superior for being celibate, that marriage was not a lesser state than virginity, that sex within marriage was not just tolerated but good, holy part of God's plan for humanity. The idea that married love could be spiritually fulfilling, that sexual intimacy within marriage was blessed rather than merely permitted, this was a significant shift from Catholic teaching that had always viewed celibacy as the higher calling. And for ordinary people, this meant that their marriages, their daily intimate lives, had religious significance in a new way. They were not just fulfilling biological urges or social obligations, they were participating in a holy covenant that had spiritual meaning. Of course, the Church still tried to regulate how married couples should behave sexually. We talked about all those rules earlier. But the theological foundation had changed. Sex in marriage was no longer something to be ashamed of, something that needed to be minimized and controlled. It was part of God's design. This is a subtle shift, but it mattered. It changed how people thought about their own desires, their own bodies, their own relationships. The Reformation also changed the physical spaces of worship in ways that affected privacy. Catholic churches had confessional booths, side chapels, spaces where individuals could have semi-private religious experiences. Protestant churches, especially the more radical reformers, stripped away these architectural features. The church became one large open space where everyone worshipped together, visible to everyone else. But at the same time, Protestant emphasis on reading the Bible meant that religious life moved into the home. Families were supposed to pray together, to read scripture together, to create what was called a family altar in their own houses. This privatization of religion meant that the home became a more important spiritual space, and with that came more emphasis on the privacy of the home, on the family as a unit separate from the larger community. We see this shift in how houses were designed during and after the Reformation. More private rooms, more doors, more separation between family spaces and servant spaces. The trend toward privacy that started with the chimney accelerated during the Reformation era, partly because of changing religious ideas about the importance of family worship and individual conscience. Now, I do not want to oversimplify this. The Reformation was not uniformly good for privacy or intimacy. In some ways, it made things worse. Protestant communities could be intensely judgmental and controlling. If you did not have a priest to confess to, you might have neighbours watching your every move, reporting suspected moral failures to the church elders or the local magistrate. In Puritan communities especially, social control could be suffocating, and the emphasis on individual conscience created new kinds of anxiety. Without the ritual of confession and absolution, some people spiraled into guilt and self-doubt. Were they saved? Were they damned? Had they sinned too much to be forgiven? There was no external authority to reassure them, so they tortured themselves with uncertainty. But overall, the Reformation contributed to a long-term trend toward privacy, toward the idea that individuals had inner lives that were their own business, toward the belief that what happened between husband and wife in their own home was not subject to community or church oversight in the same way it had been before. And this brings us full circle back to where we started this long journey through Tudor intimacy. Remember how we began with the observation that privacy, as we understand it, barely existed in early Tudor England. People slept in common rooms. They used toilets communally. They had no concept of being alone as something desirable or even normal. But by the end of the 16th century, by the time Elizabeth I died in 1603, things had changed. Wealthy people had private rooms, they had studies and closets. They had developed the expectation that certain aspects of life should be hidden from public view. This transformation happened because of architecture. Yes, the chimney made private heated rooms possible. Increasing wealth allowed people to build bigger houses with more rooms. But it also happened because of changing beliefs. The Reformation's emphasis on individual conscience, on private relationship with God, on the sanctity of the marriage bond created a religious foundation for privacy. It made privacy not just practical but spiritually meaningful. And once the wealthy had privacy, once the concept was established, it gradually spread down through society, not quickly, not evenly, but steadily. By the 18th century, even middle-class homes had separate bedrooms. By the 19th century, the idea of privacy was so ingrained that people could barely imagine living any other way. We are the inheritors of this long transformation. When you close your bedroom door, when you expect that your personal life is your own business. When you think of your home as a private sanctuary, you're experiencing the culmination of changes that began in Tudor England and took centuries to complete. But here is what strikes me most about this journey we have taken together, through 12 parts, through hours of stories about Tudor intimacy. Despite all the differences, despite the lack of privacy and the religious control and the deadly dangers of childbirth, people were still people. They still fell in love, they still desired each other, they still found ways to be tender, to be passionate, to connect with each other despite all the barriers society erected. The couple whispering to each other in that hour, between first sleep and second sleep. The merchant writing to his wife that he wishes she were in his bed. The midwife holding a newborn and feeling the weight of a dynasty in her hands. The laundress washing intimate garments and carrying secrets. The queen writing letters on the eve of her execution. The woman feeling quickening and knowing, for better or worse, that her life is about to change forever. These were real people living the real lives, navigating systems that tried to control them, finding moments of genuine human connection despite everything. And their stories matter. Not just as historical curiosities, not just as shocking revelations about how different the past was, but as reminders that intimacy has always been complicated, that privacy has always been fought for, not given freely, that the most personal aspects of human life have always been entangled with politics, religion, economics, power. We like to think we have moved beyond all that our intimate lives are our own in ways that Tudor people's lives never were, and in some ways that is true. We have privacy they could not imagine. We have freedoms they never knew. But we also have new forms of surveillance, new ways that our intimate lives are monitored and commodified. Our data is tracked, our communications are recorded, our preferences are analysed and sold. The mechanisms are different, but the tension between private life and public oversight remains. So maybe the real lesson of Tudor intimacy is not how different we are from them, but how similar. Still negotiating the boundaries between public and private, still trying to protect spaces for genuine human connection, still fighting for the right to love, to desire, to be intimate on our own terms. The Tudors did not have all the answers, neither do we. But by understanding their struggles, their compromises, their small victories and their tragedies, we understand our own lives a little better. We see that privacy is not natural or inevitable. It is created, defended, sometimes lost. We see that intimacy is always more complicated than it appears. We see that the most personal is always somehow political, and we see that through it all, humans have always found ways to be human. To love despite the rules, to create connection despite the barriers, to whisper secrets in the dark and build lives together and hope for better futures. That has not changed in 500 years, and I do not think it ever will. Thank you for staying with me on this journey through the hidden intimacies of Tudor life. Thank you for listening to stories about people who lived half a millennium ago, but who still have something to teach us about what it means to be human, to be vulnerable, to be intimate. I hope you have learned something. I hope you have felt something. I hope that when you look at your own life, your own relationships, your own private moments, you see them with new eyes. You recognize how much we have gained and what we have lost. You appreciate the privacy you have while understanding what it costs to achieve. These stories from Tudor England are not just history. They are part of our story, the long human story of learning how to live together, how to love each other, how to create spaces where we can be our full, complicated, messy, beautiful selves. And there are so many more stories to tell, so many other times, other places, other ways that humans have navigated intimacy and privacy and the complicated dance of being both individuals and members of communities. So I will see you again soon for another journey into the past, another exploration of the hidden corners of history where real people lived real lives that still echo in our own. Until then, sleep well, dream peacefully, and when you wake up in the middle of the night, in that quiet hour that used to belong to our ancestors, remember them. Remember what they knew and what they lost and what they gave us. Good night.